The first is a contempt report recommended last night by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. It calls for the House to hold Jeffrey Clark, a former Trump Department of Justice official, in contempt of Congress for defying a duly issued subpoena and to refer the matter to the U.S. Attorney. We said from the outset that we were going to get to the truth of what happened on that dark day. The issue of preserving our democracy is too important to let anyone stonewall or try to hide the truth. I want to be clear. We are not going to report a rule on this measure today. Before we take this to the floor, the Select Committee will give Mr. Clark one more opportunity to do the right thing here and show up in person on Saturday. And I hope he takes it. But make no mistake, if Mr. Clark does not comply on Saturday, this committee will be prepared to move forward with a vote on the House floor, holding him in contempt of Congress. This is not some witch hunt. This is not about trying to use the legal system to target those involved with the prior president. Mark Meadows, Trump's former chief of staff, isn't a matter before us today, because thankfully he has agreed to appear before the committee and provide documents. We will see if he cooperates with the committee's investigation going forward, and I sincerely hope that he does. But this is about fairness. It's about doing what's right, because we will get to the truth, and we will follow it wherever it leads. As I've said before, these matters come down to a fundamental choice, whether we are going to preserve American democracy and the rule of law, or put defending Donald Trump above all else. And I know where I stand. Lastly, I want to recognize the Select Committee for its work, especially Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney. You are putting country before party, despite some pretty strong headwinds. And we are thankful for that, and we are grateful for your leadership. Second, we will be meeting today on H.R. 6119, the Further Extending Government Funding Act. There's nothing controversial about it. This bill makes very minimal changes. It would simply keep the lights on through February 18th as work continues on a longer-term measure. We have passed government funding bills here in the House. Democrats in the Senate have released all of their appropriations bills. I expect that we can complete this work, and hopefully soon. Keeping our government funded is among the most basic responsibilities that we have. I know the American people will breathe a sigh of relief when we not only pass this short-term bill, but also finally enact a longer-term bill that addresses the serious challenges that they face. We should achieve all of this with bipartisan support. And with that, let me now turn to our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments that he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing today covers two items: a continuing resolution to fund the government through February 18, 2022, and yet another contempt of Congress resolution. I'll discuss the contempt of Congress resolution first. Unfortunately, this resolution comes to us as a result of an inherently political process driven by an inherently political Select Committee. The subject of today's resolution was a high-ranking official in the Department of Justice during the Trump administration. As this committee is well aware, President Trump has initiated litigation with the Select Committee concerning the scope of its subpoenas. In the course of that litigation, President Trump has asserted questions of executive privilege. It's up to the courts to make a final determination of the scope of President Trump's privilege claims. The right to make that determination does not lie with Congress. After being subpoenaed, the subject of today's resolution appeared for a deposition and has repeatedly tried to work with the Select Committee to narrow the scope of questions that were asked and documents sought. The witness informed the Select Committee that due to President Trump's assertion of executive privilege, he could not answer questions that touched executive privilege until the courts have ruled on this question, as he should have. And to make matters worse, I understand from yesterday's business meeting of the Select Committee that the witness has agreed to appear at a deposition scheduled for this Saturday. I understand that the witness intends to plead the Fifth Amendment at this deposition, and I would remind the committee that our friend, Representative Raskin, for whom I have great respect, who's a member of both this committee and the Select Committee, noted with respect to Steve Bannon that showing up to a deposition to plead the Fifth Amendment is an acceptable response to a subpoena, stating that, quote, if Mr. Bannon wants to show up and plead the Fifth Amendment because he will incriminate himself, He has that constitutional right, unquote. But not content with that result, the Select Committee now seeks to refer the witness for prosecution under criminal contempt. This is an arbitrary and punitive decision, one that seeks to punish the witness for failing to bend to the wishes of the Select Committee. It's wildly premature, given that the witness has already agreed to appear on Saturday to assert his constitutional rights, and it's nothing more than political theater and yet another distraction when the House should be focused on governing the country. I fail to see what else the witness realistically could have done under the circumstances. The witness has been engaging with the Select Committee in apparent good faith and is working to cooperate to the extent he can under the law, but is also bound by his obligations to the former president and his assertions of executive privilege. The Select Committee and the House should allow the legal process to play out and should not be referring the witness for criminal contempt even before the process is complete in the Select Committee. Criminal contempt, as opposed to civil contempt, is an inherently punitive measure, which means it will not help the Select Committee get the documents or testimony they claim to seek, regardless of what my friends on the other side think. I fear the majority will continue to erode the legal standing and credibility of the institution with the partisan manner in which they use the subpoena authority of the House. The second item I'll discuss is H.R. 6119, the continuing resolution through February 18, 2020. As members will recall, this is the second continuing resolution we've had to do this fiscal year. I voted in favor of the CR the last time the House considered this in good faith, assuming that the majority would actually engage with Republicans on a path forward. Instead, sadly, Democrats have only focused on their latest shiny object, the Partisan Reconciliation Bill. The ongoing efforts to enshrine partisan policies into law may satisfy their base, but they fail the American people as a whole, and they sabotage the appropriations process. Mr. Chairman, the funding of government and keeping it open is the most fundamental responsibility of Congress. We owe it to our constituents to ensure that services they need do not cease, however temporarily, because of the failure to appropriate the needed funds. Democrats currently control the White House, the House, and the Senate, and if they can corral the votes, they have the ability to pass whatever they want into law. But with that ability also comes a responsibility to govern the country. And appropriations bills can only pass in the end in a bipartisan manner. Unfortunately, it's clear that the majority has been avoiding that responsibility. Nowhere is this more apparent than with the appropriations process. Since we last passed a continuing resolution at the end of September, nothing has changed. Not involving Republicans until the very last minute. I heard about this deal this morning, shortly after 8 o'clock. Is just expecting us to indefinitely support CR after CR is not a way to govern. And the failure to have any conversations about how to come to an agreement on a full-year appropriations process is, in my view, indefensible. While I'm sure President Trump will be only too delighted to have his last budget continue on for almost a year after he's left office, there is real work left to be done. But perhaps what is most frustrating has been the way in which the majority has bungled reaching a relatively simple deal on this particular continuing resolution. Knowing full well that this Friday's deadline was coming up, the majority instead dithered for months on their reconciliation package. This week, finally acknowledging that real discussions needed to be had with Republicans, the majority indeed continued to twiddle their thumbs. Indeed, Republicans in the House were completely shut out of this process, leaving us all in the dark about the nature of today's bill until this morning. Once again, the majority has chosen to go it alone rather than choosing to work across the aisle. This is no way to govern, Mr. Chairman. The majority has demonstrated very clearly that they are unserious about the business of governing this nation. They are unserious about reaching a bipartisan full-year spending deal, just as they are unserious about reaching a deal on this continuing resolution. Sooner the majority gets serious about governing, the better for the country. There are real damaging consequences to these failures, both here and abroad, and I urge them to change course sooner rather than later. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member yields back. Thank you for your opening. I want to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Jeffrey Clark in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with the subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney, we're delighted to have you here. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Chairman Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify. It's regrettable that Ms. Cheney and I must appear before you again seeking floor action on a criminal contempt referral. But other witnesses under subpoena have taken the position that he's above the law and can simply refuse to cooperate with the Select Committee's investigation. While he was an Assistant Attorney General at the Justice Department, Jeffrey Clark was reportedly at the center of efforts to spread misinformation about last year's election and derail the peaceful transfer of power. There's evidence that he wanted to push state legislatures to delay certification, to use the bully pulpit of the Justice Department to spread unfounded allegations about voter fraud. He reportedly went outside normal channels of communication to deal with the White House, and the former president apparently considered installing him as acting Attorney General. As the Select Committee's report lays out, we sought out voluntary cooperation from Mr. Clark. He refused. We subpoenaed him for documents and testimony. At his deposition, he wouldn't answer questions. He bickered with our members and counsel, and then got up and left. This is unacceptable, colleagues. It's unacceptable as we try to gather facts about the violence of January 6th. Let's remember what the Select Committee has set out to do: provide answers to the American people about the worst attack on the legislative branch since the War of 1812, a violent attempt to halt our constitutionally required responsibility of certifying the presidential election, and to learn everything about what led up to that day of violence. Standing in the way of that is unacceptable to me, and it should be unacceptable to all of us who care about the future of the House's oversight authority. If we do not hold Mr. Clark accountable, or anyone else who refuses to cooperate, we are creating a dangerous new norm. We are undermining our own standing as a co-equal branch of government. I want to underscore how isolated Mr. Clark is. The Select Committee has heard from more than 250 witnesses. They include 2 of Mr. Clark's supervisors at the Justice Department. A former White House Chief of Staff is even cooperating with our probe. We are not throwing around contempt referrals left and right. So far, the only person in the same category as Mr. Clark in terms of his defiance is Steve Bannon, who's now under indictment. But Mr. Clark believes he's protected by these sweeping claims of privilege, executive privilege, even though the former president said he wouldn't try to stop Mr. Clark from testifying, attorney-client privilege, even though Mr. Clark wouldn't say who his client is, and I stated last night, Mr. Clark came to us on Wednesday through his attorney stating that he's now claiming Fifth Amendment protections. Mr. Clark previously had the opportunity to make Fifth Amendment assertions on the record and declined, but a Fifth Amendment privilege assertion is very significant. So the Select Committee has agreed to provide him another chance to come in and assert that privilege on a question-by-question basis, which he's required to do by law if he's making such a claim. He agreed to come in, and we'll reconvene the deposition Saturday. But we cannot be delayed. The Select Committee's work is too important. We must be ready to act quickly if Mr. Clark remains in defiance of the Select Committee's subpoena. So I ask for the support of all members to advance the resolution citing Jeffrey Clark for criminal contempt of Congress and referring him to the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia for prosecution. I hope this is the last time we have to come and take up a measure like this one, but I hope to be equally clear that the Select Committee will use the tools at our disposal to get to the facts. I thank my colleagues, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cheney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Thompson, and all Ranking Member Cole and all the members of the committee. I was very pleased to hear the Ranking Member say this morning that we need to get serious about governing. These are serious matters. They're not partisan matters. These are matters that have to do with the survival of the Republic. And so I would urge all my colleagues on both sides of this panel to deal with them with that level of seriousness. Mr. Jeffrey Clark was an Assistant Attorney General. He was a Trump appointee at the Department of Justice. According to multiple sources, Clark was asked by then-President Trump to take over the role of Attorney General, partly so he could issue a series of letters falsely suggesting that the Department of Justice believed the presidential election may have been stolen. Of course, this happened after the department had repeatedly informed the president that his allegations of a stolen election were not true and were not supported by the evidence. And this happened after dozens of courts had ruled against President Trump and his election fraud claims. And this happened after the Electoral College had certified the results of the election, as our Constitution requires. We are a nation of laws, and our Justice Department has a solemn obligation to truth and to justice. Imagine what would have happened if all the Trump-appointed leaders at the Justice Department had supported Jeffrey Clark and corruptly issued those false letters. Imagine what January 6th would have been then, an even more profound constitutional crisis. But Mr. Clark was not appointed, his letters were not issued, because a group of honorable men, each appointed by Donald Trump to high positions in the Department of Justice, understood that they were bound by their higher oaths to our Constitution. They did not yield even to the president who appointed them. They faced down President Trump in the Oval Office and forcefully told him no. They would not allow the Department of Justice to be turned into an arm of President Trump's corrupt campaign to overturn the presidential election. These brave public servants told President Trump they would resign and that virtually all the other high-level Trump appointees at the Justice Department would resign as well. According to multiple accounts, the President's White House counsel also said he would resign. Important details regarding all of these events remain unknown. How did this plan with Mr. Clark originate? Who else was involved? And how did it progress so far? The American people are entitled to all of these answers, and we need the full story in order to legislate effectively. But Mr. Clark has so far refused to testify. Now, as the chairman noted, Mr. Clark last night indicated that he intends to invoke the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, apparently because he believes testimony about his interactions with President Trump would tend to incriminate him and thus may subject him to criminal prosecution. We will depose Mr. Clark on Saturday, and at that point, we will know exactly what testimony Clark believes may incriminate him. If I had asked each of you on this dais on January 6th whether we need to investigate, every one of you would have said yes. You all knew what had happened was unacceptable. As my longtime friend, the gentleman from Oklahoma, the ranking member of this committee, has said, quote, "To be clear, the shameful perpetrators of the Capitol siege must and will be held accountable for their crimes and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." He went on, "Indeed, the president must also realize that his words carry meaning, and he must accept responsibility for them." My friend and colleague from North Dakota, who will appear here shortly, Mr. Armstrong, said on January 6th, quote, "I just walked through the Capitol on my way back to the House floor. The Capitol Police are still there, exhausted, bloodied, bandaged. Some are on stretchers. They did their job today, and they did it well." It's not just the American public, Mr. Chairman, who deserves answers here. We owe those officers who fought selflessly for the safety of everyone in this room a full and frank accounting of exactly what happened. As I have said before, it would have been preferable if Congress had formed an independent commission to investigate all of these facts. Yet as the political winds changed, many of you voted against such a commission. So this is the investigation that we have, and the events of January 6th cannot go uninvestigated. The Select Committee will do its duty. Let me remind you all, Republican leader McCarthy made the conscious choice to withdraw entirely from this committee. He could have appointed multiple Republicans to our committee, but he calculated, after objecting to the establishment of a bipartisan commission, that it would be better not to participate at all. Following that, Chairman Thompson decided that this will be a nonpartisan investigation, and that is how we are proceeding. And we are making rapid progress. We anticipate next year we will be conducting multiple weeks of public hearings, setting out for the American people in vivid color exactly what happened every minute of the day on January 6th here at the Capitol and at the White House, and what led to that violent attack. I would urge all of you on this panel to recognize that history is watching. We hold these positions of public trust to do what is right and just. Above all, our duty is to preserve our republic, not to act for political convenience, not to attempt to conceal what happened. I would ask each of you, please do your duty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank both of you for your testimony and for your service on this committee and for your service to this country. I think history is, this is an important moment in our history, and it is vitally important that we get to the truth and that there be accountability. It is stunning to me that so many people want to put January 6th in the rearview mirror as somehow nothing happened that day, or it wasn't a big deal. I was one of the last people off the House floor, and I saw these cowards who attacked the Capitol almost face to face, and I'll never forget it. And it was a shameful day, and anybody who played a role in that ought to be not only ashamed of themselves, but they ought to be held to account. And so I wish that the original commission that had been proposed, the bipartisan committee, had been approved. It wasn't, but I think both of you have conducted yourselves with impartiality and in a nonpartisan way. And I think the American people are grateful for that. So I have no questions. I'll yield to Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thompson, I think it's important that the committee, our committee, fully understand before voting on whether or not to advance a matter of this magnitude to the full House exactly what's occurred. So I have a few questions that are just factual I want to run through fairly quickly. Did Jeffrey Clark appear before the committee for a deposition?
Yes, he did.
Mr. Chairman, how long did he appear before the committee?
I can't tell you the specific time, but I can tell you that he did not answer any questions, and he got up and left.
Can you give me sort of an approximate estimate of how long?
I'll defer to the Vice Chair. Do you? 90 minutes?
He was in the room with us for approximately 90 minutes, Mr. Cole. But again, he provided no documents, provided no substantive answers to our questions. I'm sure, as the ranking member knows, our strong preference is to get answers. Our preference is not to have to hold people in contempt, because we believe that the events of that day must be investigated.
Thank you. How many members of the committee were present during the deposition?
Personally, or?
Yeah, well, you know, I would consider remote being present.
All of the members at some point were present.
Was an executive branch official, or was he an executive branch official during the duration of the time covered by the subpoena and subject to the deposition.
Yes.
And how many questions total would you say Mr. Clark was asked?
Mr. Ranking Member, we made clear, actually, to ensure that the record reflected the questions asked and Mr. Clark's unwillingness to actually respond to those questions. And I would just note, Mr. Clark was a recipient of the same letter from the Department of Justice that Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue, his two superiors, received that instructed that he cooperate with the committee because of the exceptional nature of the events under investigation, and yet he failed to do so.
Okay, how many questions did Mr. Clark invoke executive privilege on?
Well, he did a number of instances, but the specific number we'll have to.
Yeah, if you could get back to us on that, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman, that's fine. I certainly understand that. On November 6th, 2021, Mr. Chairman, you were quoted in news reports as saying, "I've considered Mr. Clark's claim of privilege and rejected it." Yet you're really not the final arbiter of that claim, are you? And does that really belong? You're certainly allowed to make an independent judgment, but do you have the authority to make the decision?
As chair, I do.
Really? Okay. Did Mr. Clark, through his counsel, tell the committee that he would, quote, abide by a future judicial decision, unquote?
Repeat it, please.
Yes, sir. Did Mr. Clark, through his counsel, tell the committee that he would, quote, abide by a future judicial decision, unquote?
Yes, but that has no real issue before the deposition. He can say that. I would assume if he's a law-abiding citizen, he would do that anyway.
Well, I think that's an important consideration here before we move ahead on criminal contempt. When somebody says, if the court tells me that I'm wrong, I'll do what the court tells me to do. I think that's actually
But he's not in court.
Oh, I think, no, he's not. But he's telling you if a court, he disagrees, obviously, with you on executive privilege. And
Well,
with all due respect, you don't get to make the decision on that. A court does.
well,
Or Congress doesn't. I'm not saying you personally, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we have that
but the
authority.
point is, he's not in court on this issue. The other issue is President Trump has not asserted executive privilege on his behalf.
Okay. Appears the committee believes that it's not bound by, honestly, the rule of law. Is there anything the committee asked for that it shouldn't get? I mean, should literally everything you ask for you should get?
Well, at this point, we provided a series of document requests to Mr. Clark, of which he's provided none.
Okay, did Mr. Clark offer to discuss items of interest with the committee on a more limited scope until the executive privilege questions could properly be determined?
Well, he made that assertion, but again, our position as a committee is that the deposition goes forward. He was not a party to the suit, and for him to do that just appeared to be a diversion on his part.
Would the chairman yield for just a minute? Mr. Ranking Member, I think it's also clear, and I'm sure you recognize as well, that an assertion of executive privilege does not prevent someone from having to appear to testify in response to a congressional subpoena, and I'm sure that's not the position that you're taking. Mr. Clark, if he appropriately wants to assert executive privilege, could appear in front of the committee and item by item, question by question, do so. Mr. Clark refused to engage in responding to questions that are clearly outside of any conceivable executive privilege. As the record of our exchange with him shows, he then left and refused to return. And so an attempt simply to avoid having to respond to a congressional subpoena by making some broad claim of executive privilege, I think you know is outside the bounds of the law. And I think, frankly, that it's unacceptable for you to accuse the committee of violating the rule of law.
I wasn't there, obviously, and but it sounds to me, I mean, as if he did assert executive privilege item by item. You had 90 minutes to question him.
He didn't.
Okay, well, I'll be happy to look at the record on that. After Mr. Clark's deposition, was he provided with an opportunity to review the final version of his transcript?
Well, that is up to the House clerk to provide that document.
Was he told to sign a non-final version?
The deposition transcript's online.
He was or was not? Okay.
He reviewed.
Well, I think I have the answer to my question. Thank you. Is Mr. Clark returning for an additional deposition on Saturday?
Well, subject to the meeting that we had last night, it's our expectation that he will come.
So why are you asking the Rules Committee to meet to refer Mr. Clark for criminal contempt prior to completion of his deposition?
Well, we've been trying to get Mr. Clark to complete his deposition since we started in October. And this is quite a long time for him to get to this point. And for him to tell us less than an hour before a posted hearing that he wants to assert his first Fifth Amendment privileges, we felt was not in the best interest of the committee's work. He can come. We gave deference to the request and deferred it until Saturday.
But why are we acting before you've finished that process?
Well, my understanding, based on what the chairman just said, is you'll hear the presentation, you'll hold in abeyance a vote until whether or not he shows up.
Why are we meeting in that way?
Well, you have to ask the chairman.
No, I think you requested the hearing meeting. The chairman didn't request you come before us, I don't
Look,
believe.
We are going forward with our body of work. This gentleman has not, in the committee's feeling, bargained honestly with us. It's been a dilatory tactics on the part of his attorney. And again, we're making a good faith effort to cooperate.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. With that in mind, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a series of letters exchanged between Chairman Thompson and the counsel representing Mr. Clark from August 2nd to November 29th.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And let me just say, I do think it's appropriate that we're holding a hearing, and we're talking about these issues in a public way, because I think people are very concerned about the lack of cooperation by some key individuals in this investigation. And again, we'll see what happens on Saturday. So we will not report anything out today. But this should be a message that we are serious about getting to the truth. Mr. Cheney.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I think it's very important to note that the engagements that the committee has had with Mr. Clark's attorney, and I'm very pleased that the ranking member is going to enter those letters into the record, because I think people will be able to see, as they can see with his deposition, which is available online, the extent to which he has been contemptuous of the committee. We take very seriously people's Fifth Amendment right, and I think it's important for people to understand what that means when someone says that they intend to plead the Fifth. It means they're concerned that the activity about which we're asking may tend to incriminate them, may open them to criminal prosecution. So the committee, because we are conducting ourselves in a way that's nonpartisan, in a way that is serious, in a way that is judicious, took the extra step, went beyond. Even though Mr. Clark has already been contemptuous, has already refused to fulfill his obligations under his subpoena, we have said, listen, if you've told us now at the last moment that you intend to assert a Fifth Amendment right, we certainly do not want to preclude you or prevent you from doing that. Therefore, we are going forward with these contempt proceedings. We will not finalize them until you have had the chance. If you want to do so appropriately, you may appear on Saturday, question by question, assert your Fifth Amendment privilege if that's what you believe you need to do. So the committee is acting in a way that is entirely fair and judicious, reflecting how seriously we take our duties to the Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, an act of terrorism happened on January 6th. We could sit here and pretend, you know, that nothing happened. But people were severely injured, and several have died. We could act as a third world country, and as they do with narco traffickers, and go after the street corner drug dealer while facilitating the real narco traffickers and protecting their cargo. But this is America. This is the land of the free. And when we pledge allegiance, we say, with liberty and justice for all. All of us were victims. Well, I don't want to call myself a victim anymore. I'm beyond that. To some of my colleagues that continue to push me to move beyond that. I call myself a survivor of that incident. There were thousands of people here that day, naive, bottom feeders, foot soldiers, who were told to come to the U.S. Capitol because an election had been stolen. The votes were cast, a fair election happened, it was certified, we were doing our job. Justice cannot be accomplished without holding those people who organized that violent attempt to overthrow our government accountable. So, to Mr. Clark, we want to know, and the American people deserve to know, the people who have paid for your salary deserve to know, what do you know about the planning, the plotting of the incidents that led to that horrific day? I personally would like to know, what were you doing on January 6th, Mr. Clark? Were you watching on TV at a safe location because you knew what was happening? Did you know that our law enforcement officers were going to be beaten with the American flag the way they were beaten? Did you know that members of Congress would have to crawl on their knees from one side of the Capitol to the other? Were you celebrating on the sidelines with the rest of the administration? Or were you in shame with your head down? I like to know, because I am a survivor of that day. And I am so sorry that my colleagues sitting here today and my other colleagues that are participating in this tremendous work that you're doing have to do the work that you have to do. But I continue to just admire you for having the courage. I don't know that many of us, Liz, would have the courage that you have. But you know, when your dad came to visit a couple of years ago, I saw him beam with pride when he looked at you. And now I know why. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that I have much more to add after Mr. Cole's excellent opening statement and his questioning, but just as a practical matter, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Clark comes back in for a deposition on Saturday, asserts his privilege under the Fifth Amendment. We have already voted out a contempt resolution out of this committee?
No.
So what happens then?
Well, we will review the body of his deposition and see whether or not, if he asserts a 100% Fifth Amendment assertion to all the questions. If he does not provide committee requested documents the committee will have to make a decision on that.
It just seems like we're getting things out of order, and as Mr. Cole correctly pointed out, we do face an appropriations lapse in about 48 hours. We haven't done our work on that, and it seems like if you have the deposition scheduled for Saturday, that this activity, Congress will be in session next week. No reason that the Rules Committee could not reconvene if that's your wish, but this just seems to be absolutely out of sequence, and it makes no sense. So we'll reserve other questions for the other witnesses that we have and not consume further time in this exercise.
Yeah, so let me just point out for the record that, you know, that if we are going to report out a contempt resolution, we will have to meet again next week. So we are just taking testimony today.
Yeah,
So we will
which
have
is-
to
which
meet
just
again
begs the
today.
point.
And I don't know if the gentleman heard my opening statement, but right after this, we're taking up the continuing resolution to keep the government running. So we don't want to fall into the situation that my friends did when they controlled the White House and Congress and shut the government down. We want to make sure that the government keeps on running. So we will do that right after this. So we will get to that. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank you two, honestly, for two things. One, you give me hope in this place, and two, you make me proud to be a member of Congress, okay? Ms. Cheney, you make me proud to be from the Rocky Mountain West. And,
Just south of God's country.
you know, I carry this thing in my wallet called Cowboy Ethics.
Yeah.
And it says, and everybody, we all do a measure of this, but it's 10 principles to live by. First, live each day with courage. Second, take pride in your work. Third, always finish what you start. Fourth, do what has to be done. Fifth, be tough but be fair. Sixth, when you make a promise, keep it. 7, ride for the brand. 8, talk less and say more. And 9 and 10 are really the keys here. Remember that some things aren't for sale, and 10, know where to draw the line. And I just want to thank you two for your service. I want to thank the committee for its service. This is not fun work. This is difficult. It is, but I'm proud to be a member of Congress, and I yield back.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I just want to associate my remarks with the ranking member and, of course, my good friend, Dr. Burgess. Thank the witnesses for coming here and yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a member of the Select Committee on the January 6th attack, Mr. Chairman, I want to start by expressing my great pride in the work of Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney. And I can tell the members of this committee that these two individuals we have up here, as Mr. Perlmutter suggested, are working every single day, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and they start again right through the Thanksgiving holiday to make this report to the American people about the nature of this atrocity that took place on January 6th. The most sweeping and violent attack on the work of the United States Congress since the War of 1812, and perhaps the most dangerous, divisive political event since the Civil War that has taken place in our country. And we're in very capable hands with these two people working together. That's the first thing I want to say about their leadership. But the second thing I want to say, having served in Congress now for 5 years, is I have never seen a more bipartisan committee. I've never seen a more nonpartisan committee. I've never seen a committee in our House of Representatives that's not consumed with ideological polemics and attacking the other side, but rather focused on the goal and the work of the committee. It is remarkable, and it should be a model not just to the country, but to Congress itself, how we can operate when we put partisanship aside and we put the interests of the nation first. Now, let me start with this question for you, Mr. Chairman. How many witnesses have been interviewed by the January 6th committee and its staff lawyers? How many have come before it?
At this point, about 250.
250 people have voluntarily come before the committee or answered affirmatively to a subpoena. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so all the attention is going to a handful of cases of people who are in absolute glorious violation of the law, according to the committee, like Steve Bannon, or in this case, Jeffrey Clark. But the vast majority of the people are cooperating. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, Ms. Cheney, you said something really important. You mentioned Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue. First of all, tell us who those people were at the Department of Justice.
Jeffrey Rosen was the acting attorney general, and Mr. Donahue was his deputy. So the two of them were Mr. Clark's superiors.
They were his bosses, right? And who had appointed Rosen and Donahue to their positions?
President Trump.
So these were Trump appointees. Now, have these two individuals rendered testimony to the January 6th committee?
They have, extensively.
And that was without the requirement of a subpoena?
That's correct.
And did they plead the Fifth Amendment?
They did not.
Did they assert executive privilege?
I do not believe so. And they, in fact, were the recipients of a letter from the Justice Department indicating that the exceptional nature of these events required that they provide testimony to this committee.
Okay, so what we've got is a situation where Mr. Clark's bosses at the Department of Justice have freely and voluntarily and fully testified to the committee about everything that they know about the events we're interested in, about the attack on January 6th, and about the attempt to subvert and overthrow the presidential election result in 2020. And yet, Jeffrey Clark, who's below them in the Department of Justice totem pole, is asserting an executive privilege from Donald Trump, but Donald Trump has not asserted that executive privilege. Is that right, Mr. Chairman?
That's correct.
So Donald Trump is not trying to stop him from testifying by invoking an executive privilege. In fact, he sent a letter to that effect, didn't he, Ms. Cheney?
Yes, and it's important to note Mr. Clark is not appropriately asserting any privilege. He's just sort of making a blanket statement that because of these privileges, I don't have to answer your questions, which is not, of course, how privilege works.
To be clear about this, because our colleagues fairly asked the question, did he appear before the committee and answer a whole bunch of questions and then say, but I'm not going to answer that one because that may violate an executive privilege, or I'm not going to answer that one because that may violate my Fifth Amendment rights? Is that what he did?
No, that's not
What did he do?
He in fact, asserted privilege in response to every question, essentially.
In fact, he didn't even assert a privilege in response to specific questions. He just said, refer to my letter. And that letter just asserted a whole basket of privileges in a blanket umbrella way, right?
That's correct.
And so the committee unanimously voted yesterday that he is in contempt, right? And our colleagues are saying, well, we're putting the cart before the horse because he showed up a few minutes before we voted and said, oh, there was another privilege I wanted to assert. I wanted to assert the Fifth Amendment privilege because I might incriminate myself. In other words, he's not saying there are a whole bunch of things I'm willing to testify about now. He's saying, I just want to throw in another legal argument about why I'm not saying anything, right?
That's correct.
So the distinguished ranking member of this committee also makes this argument about somehow we're putting the cart before the horse, because he's saying a court has to determine that his executive privilege arguments, which President Trump isn't even making, are frivolous before we proceed. Is that the law? Wouldn't that destroy Congress's powers under criminal contempt if we said we had to wait for somebody else to decide first before we could act?
That's correct.
I mean, Ms. Cheney, doesn't this go right to the heart of whether Congress can exercise its investigative powers under Article 1?
It does, Mr. Raskin, and in fact, there were numbers of questions that we have continued to make clear to Mr. Clark couldn't conceivably be covered by any privilege whatsoever. And yet, as you point out, he just simply, refers to this blanket assertion of privileges that seem to, make him feel apparently as though he is above the law across the board.
Did he produce any documents?
No.
Did he answer any substantive questions at all? No, okay.
Let the record reflect that's a
No.
shake of the head, no.
Let me ask this question. Donald Trump has once said, the mob takes the Fifth. If you're innocent, why are you taking the Fifth Amendment? That's not our position, is it? I mean, we believe in the Fifth Amendment, don't we?
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, we take it seriously. If someone comes before our committee and they answer the question about their name and their job and general information, but then they say, you know what? I think that that question might tend to incriminate me. Somebody could use that against me in a criminal prosecution. We would take that under advisement, wouldn't we?
Yes, we would.
Is that what happened here, Mr. Chairman? Or did he just categorically say, I'm not interested in what you people have to do, read my letter?
That's correct. And at this point, the only thing we have as a committee is the letters making the assertion, because that gentleman, Mr. Clark, has not come before us to even make the assertion of Fifth Amendment rights.
There was an effort to convert the Department of Justice into a political arm of the president in his plan to subvert and overthrow the result in the 2020 presidential election. So this is serious business that we're talking about. Ms. Cheney, let me come to you. What's the importance of us figuring out this dimension of the events that took place leading up to and on January 6th?
Well, Mr. Eskin, you're right in how you've described what was going on at the Department of Justice. And what we have heard from Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue, and what we have seen in the documents that they have turned over, is the extent to which Mr. Clark was at the heart of those efforts. And that, in fact, Mr. Clark was attempting to put the Department of Justice in a position where it was asserting, through this letter that he wanted to send first to Georgia and then to other states, where the Department of Justice was essentially asserting the election had been stolen and urging action on the part of these states after our Electoral College had met, after over 60 of President Trump's and those allied with him, those challenges had been rejected by the courts. So he was in a position where it wasn't just politicizing the Department of Justice. It was, as you say, attempting to take the Department of Justice and make it part of an effort to subvert the democratic process. And we need to understand exactly what Mr. Clark's role was in that, as well as who else he was working with to try to fulfill those corrupt endeavors.
And have there not been published reports and some suggestion in the Senate Judiciary Committee proceedings that Mr. Clark might have become the Attorney General? There was some effort that he would be plucked from the mid-level of the bureaucracy and turned into Attorney General in order to make the Department of Justice part of this plan. Is that right, Mr. Chairman?
Yes. What we saw in the report is the politicalization of the Justice Department to the point that it would be weaponized against its own citizens for a particular political reason. The most of us who are in Congress, we actually believe in the rule of law. We believe that if all else fails, our Justice Department is there to defend the rule of law. And what we have started to see in this situation with Mr. Clark is an effort to subvert the law for a political reason. But in order to document it, we have to get the individuals before us and ask the question. Now, if Mr. Clark decides on Saturday not to answer that question and plead the Fifth because it might incriminate him, then to some degree that gives us an answer. But it's a right and privilege that afforded him as an American citizen to assert that right.
Right, according to legal specifications in precise answer to specific questions. All right, well, look, I want to close with 2 points. One is the Supreme Court has emphasized that when you get a subpoena It is a public duty which every person within the jurisdiction of the government is bound to perform when properly summoned. This is not a close question. And that doesn't just mean you show up physically. It means that you produce the documents and you make the answers, unless you have a valid specific privilege that you can invoke with respect to particular questions. And that's what the committee is insisting upon. The word contempt is interesting because the linguists tell us that the obverse of contempt is resentment. And contempt is something that you feel for people that you believe are below you. Resentment is something you feel for people you fear may be above you. But he doesn't resent us. He has contempt for us. He thinks we're below him. He believes that the representatives of the American people are below him. He's a lawyer. He understands what his responsibility is. He knows that his superiors, his bosses, have rendered full, complete, truthful testimony, we assume, in this case. He just thinks we're beneath him. Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, do you have any regrets about holding this individual in criminal contempt of Congress?
Absolutely not.
Madam Vice Chair, I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of our ranking member, Mr. Cole, and I know that Mr. Burgess had asked a bit about, or talked a little bit about this not being ripe yet, and I would agree with that. I think we are jumping the gun. You admittedly said there's a Saturday meeting that you're waiting for, so all of this could be handled next week. And my understanding is we're not even going to process it today. We are just taking testimony on something that could or couldn't happen, and we're waiting on a Saturday meeting, so I really feel like this is certainly jumping the gun. I also just want to comment a little bit on, some of the things. When it comes down to it, these subpoenas are supposed to be for a legislative purpose. And we talked about this the last time we did this. I am not hearing that. What I've been hearing is, and I think I've got some of the quotes, or at least paraphrased, we need answers to the American people and what led up to that day. We need full and frank accounting of what happened, things, and accountability. Very little, there's rarely a mention of any kind of legislative purpose for this kind of process that we're going through, the commission, whatever it is called at this point. But and with that, I'm just going to yield back because there's, but again, I think we are jumping the gun on this.
I think Ms. Cheney wanted to respond. Oh, well, I'm going to give her the courtesy of responding.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think that this is an important issue about legislative purpose, and it's something that has been raised a number of times, and I would just direct the gentlelady to some of the things that the committee has, in fact, laid out as our legislative purpose. First, the plot that we are investigating, this plot attempted to halt or delay our count of electoral votes and reverse the outcome of the 2020 election. The 1887 Electoral Count Act is directly at issue, and our investigation will lead to recommendations to amend or reform that act. Second, while the attack was underway, President Trump knew what was happening. Indeed, he may have been watching it all unfold on television, and yet he took no immediate action to stop it. That would appear to be a supreme dereliction of duty by President Trump. And this committee is evaluating whether our criminal laws should be enhanced to supply additional and more severe consequences for this type of behavior. Third, we know from our investigation to date that President Trump was pressuring the Department of Justice in late 2020 to support his false claims that the election was stolen. As we've discussed here today, several brave and honorable Trump appointees at the department flatly refused to go along with this fraud and threatened to resign. The committee is evaluating what, if any, additional laws may be required to prevent a future president from succeeding in any such effort. Fourth, we know that President Trump made efforts to persuade state election officials to, quote, find votes to change the election outcome in his favor. This committee is evaluating whether the criminal laws of the United States should be enhanced to make the penalty for this type of behavior even more severe, and if so, In what manner? So those, Mr. Chairman, are just an example of some of the very important legislative purposes of the committee. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
And I would just add one other legislative purpose, which might be whether we need to beef up the tools availed to Congress in terms of having prompt enforcement of congressional subpoenas. I just wanted to take a couple minutes. I mean, Jeffrey Clark is not a household name up until now. And for those who are interested, the Senate Judiciary Committee's report entitled Subverting Justice, How the Former President and His Allies Pressured the Department of Justice to Overturn the 2020 Election. This looks pretty thick, but it's like less than 50 pages of text. The rest is exhibits. So if you're interested in the topic, you can find out more there. But they were very clear. They detailed that Jeffrey Clark had attempted to enlist the Department of Justice in the former president's effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election without factual or legal basis, and in doing so clearly undermined the rule of law. The Senate specifically recommended further inquiry into Mr. Clark's attempts to subvert the rule of law and his efforts to corruptly coordinate that activity, potentially with the president, former president. So that's why he's important to this. I think you've already highlighted, and I think it's important that Mr. Bannon and Mr. Clark have been outliers in terms of refusing to respond to a congressional subpoena. None of the rest of us have the ability to refuse to respond to legal subpoenas. And that over 250 witnesses have already appeared, whether voluntarily or pursuant to subpoena. And I think, Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that Mr. Clark's superiors have responded, have said that he didn't have a basis for doing what he was proposing to do, and that there was no executive privilege to be asserted here. It's important to the public that we get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th and who should be held accountable for it. I held a town hall on Monday in which it was a topic of conversation, and people wanted to know how quickly could the January 6th Commission move, because they perceive that our Constitution and our democracy are at an inflection point, and we need to get to the bottom of this. And they were very concerned about the fact that people were putting themselves above the law and refusing to respond to congressional subpoenas. So this, I firmly believe we need to give the committee the tools that it needs to do its job promptly and effectively. We know from history that the former president and his allies have a long, long history dating back to his pre-presidential years of using the legal system to run out the clock, to exhaust people, to just not show up. And that's compounded in this instance because we know that most of the Republican Party is saying that if they regain power in the House, they're going to end this committee. So running out the clock through the midterm elections could mean that we don't ever get the answers to what happened here, and we'll be left with an even more serious threat to our Constitution. It's also important to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which Mr. Reschenthaler and I represent. This same Senate Judiciary Committee report, which exposed Mr. Clark's corrupt conduct with the former president, recommended that the House January 6th Committee investigate the connections between Mr. Clark and the January 6th organizers and Pennsylvania Representative Scott Perry and Pennsylvania State Senator Doug Mastriano. It's important to Pennsylvanians that they know whether or not they have elected officials who were involved in trying to foment an insurrection. So for that reason as well, I support prompt action to get this testimony. So because Mr. Clark's testimony is important to establishing accountability for January 6th, because the threat to our constitutional order is real and present, and we need the committee to be able to fulfill its duties, and because the people of Pennsylvania have the right to know what is going on with their elected officials. I'm very happy that the committee has come to us so that it can move promptly. The January 6th committee is serious. The majority of the House is serious about getting to the bottom of this, and we want you to be able to move promptly if Mr. Clark does not testify in accordance with the law this weekend. So thank you.
Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the chair and the vice chair for being here today. On the one hand, as it relates to the question of whether we're jumping the gun here and the suggestion that that's the case, it appears to me, and you certainly can comment on it, that Mr. Clark has avoided all efforts to answer questions, and it's only because we're holding this hearing this morning and the prospects of bringing a contempt resolution against him that he's even entered into any serious discussion about attending the meeting on Saturday. Is that not correct?
Well, that's correct. This will be his second deposition attempt because the first, we got no real answers. And so we're giving him a last chance to come before the committee and assert whatever points of law that he'd like to make. But he has to come before the committee to do that.
And it's your belief that our actions this morning is what's prompted him to actually suggest that he's willing to at least come and assert whatever those rights are?
Well, this is part of the process. We got last night, just before our business meeting, a letter from his attorney saying, oh, before you meet, I want you to know we're going to assert our Fifth Amendment privilege. Well, this was something new, and the committee, out of deference to the attorney, said, okay, we'll still do our business, and if you're serious, we will allow you an opportunity to assert that privilege by deposition before the committee on this coming Saturday. So that's where we are.
So I conclude from that not only is this not premature, what we're doing here this morning, this hearing, is necessary to at least compel him to come and appear before the committee for whatever he chooses to do with it. So I don't think this is premature. I think it's essential to moving forward. So just wanted to make sure that I understood that. I want to thank my colleagues on this side who I think have done an amazing job of articulating how important this is. And I would just add to this, Ms. Scanlon was talking about people back home asking, and others talking about people asking about what's going on, are you going to continue, are we going to get through this? I had that same experience over the last several months, meeting with a lot of constituents who would ask what's happened, where were you on January 6th? People are really, really concerned about this, and many of them expressing, as I've expressed here before and others have, how vital the work that you're doing is. There is, in my view, the 117th Congress is doing many things that people will agree, disagree with, that, and people will characterize what we did. I don't think there's anything more important than what you're doing and the work that you and your colleagues are doing. This is the most fundamental, foundational thing that could happen to our republic. Mr. Raskin mentioned since the Civil War, and I would argue it's at least as important as that. I mean, I think we're at this important inflection point in American history. And the one thing that I fear, and I want to thank you because I don't think you've fallen prey to this clearly with the number of people that you've interviewed, et cetera, is I worry, and Ms. Scanlon mentioned this too in her remarks, that there's a concerted effort to sort of try to fatigue the American public, where they'll say, all right, enough is enough. I mean, yeah, it was a bad day, bad things happened, we hope it doesn't happen again, but people tire. And I think there's an effort in this country to try to fatigue people so that either they don't care or it's too much. And you haven't fallen prey to that, and I'm certain that you will not, because I think that would be the biggest mistake in the life of this republic. And if we want to have our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren enjoy the great benefits of living in the greatest country, in my mind, that's ever existed, despite all our flaws in the history of humankind, we're going to have to. This is the moment where we're going to make that decision. Are we going to leave that legacy to our children or not? And the work that you're doing is so vital to that. So I just want to thank you. I appreciate. I hadn't heard the cowboy ethic, which I'm going to make a copy of and add it to my wallet with the golden rule, which is what my father always talked about. But I just think this is so vitally important. So I just want to thank both of you, thank all the members of the committee. Carry on, and you're doing us all proud. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Mr. DeSaulnier. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I again want to thank the chair and the vice chair of the January 6th Commission for their tireless work in seeking truth and seeking justice. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Morelli because I think he framed this perfectly. We are here today because Mr. Clark was planning to be in contempt. And it is only because we've taken these actions that Mr. Clark has chosen to do what he is required to do under law. Now, it may be that the Rules Committee doesn't ever have to report a rule. And it may be that the House does not have to vote on contempt. But we are providing a very, very important piece of this puzzle by showing that we are serious about the truth and we are serious about backing up the January 6th Commission's work, which is vital, And Mr. Clark may not care about the integrity of this country, and Mr. Clark may not care about the Commission. And Mr. Clark may have been operating in an administration that doesn't care or didn't care about truth and justice and protecting our democracy. But we had an election, we have a new way of operating, and Mr. Clark has to follow the law. And it is our job to make sure he understands that there are consequences if he does not. So I want to thank the Commission again for your excellent work, and I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing to show that we will hold Mr. Clark accountable if he does not follow law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just simply associate myself with the remarks of many of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle, who I think have spoken eloquently about the necessity of this action. And I agree with Ms. Ross. Clearly, Mr. Clark has an important choice to make on Saturday, and I hope he makes the right decision. So again, grateful to Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney for their leadership and their moral courage as they undertake this incredibly important work for the future of our constitutional republic. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I want to thank both of our witnesses for being here today, and you can go if you want.
Thank you.
All right. I think we have another panel who wants to testify. I want to welcome our next panel, the Honorable Kelly Armstrong of North Dakota. Just make sure your mic is on, that's all. You may proceed.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of Rules today. And I'm not here to weigh in over the actions of Mr. Clark or any other individuals on January 6th or the months prior. I was one of... Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll get closer. How's that? I was one of the Republicans who voted to certify the electors. I'm here to object to the Select Committee's what I believe is disregard for legitimate legal claims progressing through the court system. I'm here to object to the Select Committee's insistence on proceeding with a contempt of Congress referral while there is a case that has been stayed on appeal and while Mr. Clark has declared his intentions to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege. Simply put, I do not believe this contempt vote is right. Every single person anywhere in the country has a legal right to object to a subpoena. Mr. Clark has consistently informed the committee that he objects to the Select Committee's subpoena concerning issues related to executive privilege. Those claims of executive privilege are being considered in the federal courts right now. And we talk about timelines a lot. The D.C. Circuit heard oral arguments in Trump v. Thompson on Tuesday, which is 43 days since the initial complaint was filed. This is remarkably fast for federal litigation. Mr. Clark has also stated in writing to abide by the final judicial determinations of those claims. Until the D.C. Court issues its opinion, the Select Committee is placing Mr. Clark in an untenable position. The committee is placing Mr. Clark between Congress and claims of executive privilege by a former president. They are also putting him in a unique and interesting position as it relates to his potential legal obligations and ethical obligations as a lawyer. We can debate whether President Trump's executive privilege claims are likely to succeed. In fact, we know where the district court ruled, but we also know that the appellate court issued a stay on for the National Archivist. The Supreme Court in Nixon v. Administrator found that claims of executive privilege can extend beyond a president's term, although other factors may alter that claim. And in the majority and concurring opinions, they almost foretold of circumstances very similar to this, where issues like these were going to have to be determined in the courts. The court found that it cannot be measured by the few months or years between the submission of information and the end of a president's tenure. The privilege is not for the benefit of the president as an individual, but for the benefit of the republic. Therefore, the privilege survives individual president's tenure. Ultimately, the application of executive privilege in this scenario is not our decision to make. The D.C. Circuit Court will make that decision. Our decision is to determine whether this pending contempt referral vote is premature. Considering the D.C. Circuit is considering arguments on an expedited basis, this contempt, I believe it is premature. It is also premature because Mr. Clark has notified the committee that he intends to invoke the Fifth. My understanding is that will occur Saturday, 48 hours from now. Finally, I will note that in discussing Mr. Clark's intention, and this is where we get into the congressional versus legal, and I understand from a political and a policy standpoint that how people view those events and what led up to them are significant. But there's an old saying in the law, hard cases make bad law. And what we need a determination, allow it to go through the process. It is moving incredibly quickly through. And I think there's a real easy kind of answer of where the conflict before congressional and legal obligations come. And it would be that in discussing Mr. Clark's intention to invoke his constitutional right, Chair Thompson claimed that Mr. Clark has not offered a basis to do so. And that's because but the reason for that is he's not required to explain or provide a reasoning for invocation of the Fifth. And to suggest otherwise is highly inappropriate. This committee, or the chairman of the committee, who I don't know personally, but I think I would like him, my friend Liz Cheney was just testifying, they can't guarantee immunity in any court system and anywhere in the country. And without being able to do that, there is no inference as to why someone invokes their constitutional right, and there is no assumption of guilt. Politically, we can say there is, but legally there is not. And so with that, I would take any questions.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see my friend. Mr. Armstrong, seems to me that the Democratic majority is setting a new precedent once again. In your perspective, are the actions taken by the majority damaging the long-term legal standing of the institution?
Yeah, I think in our effort to enforce subpoenas, and this isn't, unfortunately for me, this isn't the first time it's happened. We held Attorney General Bill Barr in contempt for not violating the law. I think in our zeal, in our work to go through this, we're actually doing damage to this process. You are allowed to object. You are allowed to raise your objections. You are allowed to elect. We talk about the executive branch and the legislative branch a lot, but it's the judicial branch who gets to decide this. And it has to be that way, and it should continue to be that way. And as a former practicing lawyer, I mean, you know, we might not always like the decision they make, but they're not always right because we believe they're the smartest. They're right because they're last. But we have to allow that process to work itself through.
If you were in the shoes of Mr. Clark's counsel, what would you think about the House moving to refer your client for criminal contempt when you've exchanged numerous letters, have appeared for one deposition, and even have an additional deposition scheduled?
And I think, and that's an important point, right? I mean, this wasn't some, like, version of a one-sentence flippant response. There's a November 5th letter that's, you might not agree with it, but it's incredibly detailed, it's properly cited, it works through all of those issues. The November 30th stuff is fairly interesting, and when we're requiring him to show up for a committee a half hour after the committee is supposed to start it, but they have raised real issues. And I would also say that as a lawyer, as somebody who's there, if somebody else voluntarily appears in front of a committee, that doesn't negate your ability to object to a subpoena. It doesn't do that anywhere else, and it shouldn't be that way here.
Would an action like this, you know, raise concerns about the legitimacy of the investigation to you if you were again involved as a counsel in this case?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll go back to what I said. I think you're putting him in a very untenable situation. He's obviously determined that he's going to wait and he's said it in writing that he'll comply depending on what the case is. But if we continue to push forward with that and not allow what is a viable and reasonable, and we know this because the DC District Court issued a stay as well. So it's, I mean, this is the process. Everybody has a right to go to court. Everybody has a right to appeal a court decision. And we might not like how long it takes, but I'm just telling you, Mr. Cole, that 43 days in federal court's quick.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perlmutter.
You had been on this committee, that you had been appointed to this committee. I don't agree with you on your legal analysis right here that we can't press forward.
Mr. Raskin and I have thought about this more than once.
But you are a genuine man, and I think you would have taken the responsibility of this January 6th committee to heart. And it's a shame you and some others aren't on there to really do the justice that you talk about, that we have the law to require. And that's all I want to say. I yield back.
I thought you were going to read another cowboy.
No,
I
have a couple more of them.
I'm not Wyoming, but I'm Western North Dakota. I've seen that before. It's fantastic.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, we've got important work to get on to with the continuing resolution. I appreciate Mr. Armstrong being here today. I appreciate your reference to some of the historical precedent that is set in these activities. I was here when we filed criminal and civil contempt against Attorney General Eric Holder after he ignored our congressional subpoenas. Recall a different time back in the 1950s when the Hollywood 10 was affected by subpoenas before the House Un-American Activities Committee. So these things are real. They have real consequences. I just think we should take them very seriously. The gentleman in question has already agreed to appear before the committee on Saturday. He is likely to assert his rights under the Constitution, which is his prerogative, and everyone is afforded the presumption of innocence unless and until proven guilty. And am I wrong about any of that?
No, and listen, I mean, eventually this case is going to be determined, and I'll continue to talk about that. And I think it's important to note that in his detailed response, he has stated that he will abide by whatever legal decision comes out. And I think that's an important part of this. You know, we deal with all of these issues, and we move them forward. And listen, that's how this process works. Fortunately for any member who is being brought before these committees, whether it's January 6th or otherwise, they have avenues, and they're legitimate avenues that they should and always should be allowed to take. And by the way, when we're in the majority, I will probably be a thorn in our side as well, defending those same protections that they get. So.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Armstrong, always a pleasure to see you. You are a class act, and I echo Mr. Perlmutter. I really wish, as you know, that you were on this committee, and of course, we advanced an independent bipartisan commission along the lines of 9/11 Commission, which was originally the bipartisan agreement that was struck, and then Mr. McCarthy decided for whatever reasons that he wanted to pull the plug on that, and that's why we turned to a select committee, and we've tried to build in the people with the best sense of judiciousness and independence and impartiality, and I do wish that you were on the committee. Having said that, I wanted to ask you a couple questions about what you've said here. But I'm afraid that we've made it sound a little bit like there's some litigation going on related to Mr. Clark's claims of executive privilege or Fifth Amendment, and there's not, is there?
Not towards the Fifth Amendment. There is a litigation between the president and Mr. Thompson. And
right, but it's got nothing to do with Jeffrey Clark, right?
Well, Jeffrey Clark appears to think it does.
Yes, he does, but President Trump has explicitly not asserted a Fifth Amendment privilege in Jeffrey Clark's case. He sent a letter to the committee saying he was not asserting that privilege.
He actually, the Fifth Amendment the letter is silent as towards the Fifth Amendment.
I'm sorry, as to the executive privilege. And of course, it's got nothing to do with the Fifth Amendment
Yes.
for Trump.
Okay.
Let's take it from the top. Donald Trump brought a lawsuit against the committee under the Presidential Records Act. That's a statutory claim, which he lost at the district court, and now the appeals court is considering it, right? It's not constitutional, it's statutory. It's got nothing to do with Jeffrey Clark or any other witness before us, right?
Well, he's in his August 1st, 2020 letter, they actually, authorization of unlawful, and the President Trump continues to assert the non-public information. And even at the end, when he allows for the not asserting the privilege, it's contingent on whether other members are testified. So I would say that trigger goes away as well.
All right, look, you know how to be clear when you want to be clear. I want to be clear here.
Yeah.
President Trump has invoked no constitutional privilege in Jeffrey Clark's case. He has not attempted to intervene in this matter in any way. What's taking place in the D.C. Circuit is an appeal of a trial court decision which Donald Trump lost under the Presidential Records Act.
Yes.
So Jeffrey Clark says, I'm not going to answer any of your questions until an unrelated case dealing with a question of statutory interpretation is decided in another court. Now, honestly, do you think that that's a valid legal argument?
I think Mr. Clark thinks it's a valid legal argument, and he has the right to do that.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. Let's go. I can't remember. You were a former public defender or prosecutor?
I was a public defender.
You're a public
defender.
defender.
On the side of righteousness and goodness, Mr. Raskin.
Well, good for you. We have a couple on our side too. I think David Cicilline.
Less so on our side.
Is a former. You might be the only one. That's cool. But let's take a case. Let's take one of your cases. Okay. If you have let's say you've got a client who thinks that there's a doctor-patient privilege that would keep him from having to answer questions in a case. And he's subpoenaed to come testify, and the doctor says, no, I don't think there's any privilege, but the patient says, I think there's privilege, and I'm going to wait for an unrelated case related to that doctor to be adjudicated before I testify. I mean, isn't that analogous? Does that make any sense?
Well, except I would not agree with your pretext that they're unrelated cases. I think they are related, and I think Jeffrey Clark believes they're related. Okay. And I think that's violent.
All right, well, then let's talk about the merits of it. Do you think executive privilege includes criminal conduct? The Supreme Court has said no. Can you assert executive privilege in a case of wrongdoing by the president or his advisors?
It's not my determination to make when.
Okay, well, the Supreme Court has said no. So they might want to revisit that in this Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court has said you can't assert executive privilege for criminal wrongdoing, much less, I would assume, a violent insurrection against the Union. So where is the relevance of executive privilege?
Well, the relevance of executive privilege is exactly what Nixon v. I always forget what it is.
Yeah, and that leaves it to the President of the United States, and President Biden has asserted no executive privilege. He's waived all executive privilege.
But the case specifically says that executive privilege in certain circumstances can pass on to a president past his term. I mean, the case is wholly about totality of the circumstances because, as you know, Mr. Nixon lost in that case. But what they said in that case, and not only what they said in that case, but what they said moving forward was that that privilege is designed to protect frank and honest discussions under an administration.
All right, well, let me just get the contours of your argument correctly, because I think you're, at this point, speaking for your side of the aisle. Are you saying that if Donald Trump loses the litigation in Trump versus Thompson, at that point you would agree that contempt logically follows for this witness, for Steve Bannon, for anybody else who's refusing on the grounds that there's an executive privilege?
I think there's very specific language in Mr. Clark's attorney's letter that says they think that.
Okay.
I mean, that's
all right, good. All right, so, but at least that's some progress because, you know, what I would love to hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, if Donald Trump loses his claims about executive privilege, at that point we agree all of this is nonsense.
Well, I will agree with you is that I think the legal cases get a little more interesting. I mean, whether they still have the right to appeal, they have the right to object, they have a right to utilize that part of our branch of government.
Do you agree that under Anderson versus Dunn and a whole set of Supreme Court decisions that the Congress of the United States has the power to obtain the information it wants from witnesses in conducting our legislative duties?
Well, I haven't read Anderson redone, but I do believe we have valid subpoena power. My concern is that I think by doing these things in this way, we're actually watering it down.
Yeah. All right. Well, I wish you were there that day. You would have seen a witness in absolute defiance and contempt of congressional power, in total violation of a congressional subpoena. And it would not be tolerated by any court in the land, and it shouldn't be tolerated by the Congress of the United States. If he really felt that he had an executive privilege, although that seems to be fading out, he seems to have collapsing confidence in that, which is why he may be shifting over to the Fifth Amendment at this point. But if he really believed that, he could have gone to court to try to stop it, but he didn't. And Donald Trump did not invoke the executive privilege on his behalf. He just thought he could wave a magic wand and say, I'm not going to participate in your proceedings. That is not what the law is, and I think you do know that. But I appreciate your appearing here. I do wish that you were on this committee very much, and you're a fine lawyer. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Armstrong, you referenced two letters. One was the letter from Attorney McDougald from 5 November. The other one was the letter from the 30th, correct? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter the letter from 30 November into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Armstrong, we've talked about 3 different issues. I think we've conflated them through questions. So just to break this down, there's been talk about, of course, executive privilege, of course, the Fifth Amendment. There's even been talk about the production of documents. We can break each one of those down briefly, but I think that to distill this down to just one question, one issue, it is the contempt resolution before us today warranted? That's it. That's all we're. Would you like to just give?
Yeah, I don't think it is.
Yes, and would you like to explain briefly why?
I think this is, like, as I've stated before, I mean, they were very detailed in their letter. His legal counsel went through it both in the 5th and in the 30th, and they're continuing to move forward. Obviously, whatever the breaking news in the last 24 hours is going to be happen on Saturday. But I think it's important to recognize that regardless of that, it still wasn't right. And that's what I mean, is as these things are litigated and as they move through the courts, you have that avenue. We talk about being litigious is not a crime. Being litigious, utilizing your legal remedies to the fullest extent of the law. This case wasn't thrown out for being frivolous. This case, this thing is moving forward, and I just believe that as you allow that to happen, you end up strengthening not only people's belief in the legal system, but also in this institution.
I want to talk about document production just a second, but to hit on your point you just made, that the letter from the 30th of November really lays out what you were saying, the position that the committee is putting Mr. Clark in. I just want to paraphrase from that letter. The committee, by moving forward before the litigation has concluded, the committee has consistently refused to wait for a resolution of the case. By doing so, it's forcing Mr. Clark to be put in a, and I quote, grotesquely unfair manner, to choose between violating his professional obligations to comply with President Trump's invocation of his privilege on the one hand, and on the other hand, being held in contempt and possibly prosecuted on the other hand. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, I think that's very clear, and I think that's the belief. And, the testimony and whether his superiors or everything go out, and there's also another part of this, which is your legal obligation as a lawyer. Somewhere in his November 5th letter, he actually cites to the New Jersey ethical rules regarding the attorney. And listen, this is a different attorney-client relationship than if I hired your esteemed legal skills to represent me in something, but it still exists. And by allowing this to move itself through, I think you get a better chance of full compliance, and 2, again, you don't put our witnesses in a situation where they have to, make one of two bad choices.
And again, we're just in this position because we're rushing this process. We
Yeah,
should be waiting for the.
Yes.
Okay, I want to hit just the document production angle before talking about the Fifth Amendment. For whatever reason, I believe through some questions, there's a misunderstanding that through a contempt resolution, we can force the production of documents. I don't believe that's true. I don't think that's how the law works. What's your understanding?
Well, I think there's I agree with your legal analysis. I also think there's a practical analysis as to who is in possession of those, since Mr. Clark has left the DOJ sometime around, I think, January 20th.
I just want to, the issue's been conflated, so just for the record, I just want to clear it up. Also, I want to hit the Fifth Amendment. You and I have both been defense attorneys. We've taken trials to verdict before juries. We've had witnesses testify. The Fifth Amendment is a bedrock of the criminal justice system. Do you feel that it's appropriate for members and others to speculate as to the motives of witnesses invoking the Fifth Amendment right, like we've heard today?
I think I don't. I also, and the reason I don't is because I've practiced criminal defense, but I also think it shows the inherent conflict between political hearings and legal hearings. I mean, the political reasons for doing that are obvious, and we understand that, but the legal reasons why you're not allowed to should also be obvious to everybody.
Yeah, and I would just like to refer back to that 30th November letter, which spells out why we have the Fifth Amendment, going back to the Star Chamber in England, et cetera. For the sake of time, I'll move on. But I also just want to take this up to today. There's a real reason why Mr. Clark doesn't want to testify. It's because people have been openly calling for his prosecution. It's not like he is invoking his Fifth Amendment right just to invoke it. There's actual reasons. In the letter, it goes through a litany of individuals, some elected, some members, calling for his prosecution. There's articles in the Washington Post, The Hill, interviews on MSNBC. This is not coming from nowhere. There's a legitimate reason, is there not, for him invoking the Fifth Amendment?
Yeah, again, I'll give you the same answer. His lawyer and him have determined there is, right? I haven't delved into, I've read the Senate report, I've done all of that. But my point to all of this is simply, this wasn't a flippant double exclamation point, one sentence nastygram that you send for client control. This is incredibly detailed. You might not agree with the analysis, but it's a valid analysis. All of it is.
Well, thank you, Mr. Armstrong. For the sake of time, I'll yield back, but thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, and it's good to see you, Mr. Armstrong, my former colleague on judiciary, and we miss you there. You're being recruited to all kinds of committees today. With respect to Mr. Clark and the subpoena, you seem to be suggesting that Mr. Clark's refusal to testify may be justified by his subjective belief that he's entitled to wait for a ruling in a case to which he's not a party, and that may provide him with some protection. Is that right?
I think Mr. Clark believes that the president has invoked executive privilege, and he's duty-bound to honor it.
Okay. Well, the Senate Judiciary Committee has already suggested that Mr. Clark has a history of championing baseless legal claims. But to be clear, Mr. Clark is free to bring his own lawsuit to quash this subpoena from the House Select Committee. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And he hasn't done so.
Not that I'm aware of.
But if he did so, he could raise this claim that this suit involving the National Archives would somehow shield him from testifying.
Yeah, and yeah.
Okay. Well, we've heard testimony from the January 6th Select Committee Chair, Mr. Thompson, that that Mr. Clark has been refusing to respond to the subpoena since October. And they've been trying to work with him, but he hasn't come in. So isn't it also true that in the absence of Mr. Clark moving to quash the subpoena, January 6th Committee could choose at some point to bring a suit to get him to respond to a subpoena?
Well, but I would disagree with he has refused to respond. I mean, he has given very detailed responses. He has given, he's a 12-page letter, a November 30th letter. He has laid out how he is doing this. He has also said in writing that he will comply with whatever the judicial adjudication
so there is the issue is joined. The January 6th Select Committee has rejected his 12-page verbiage. Okay. So you described some of the back and forth of, negotiation. He asserts something in a letter. The January 6th Committee says, we don't buy it. I would submit that it's part of that back and forth for the January 6th Committee to signal that it is serious about enforcing its subpoenas, and for the House of Representatives to back up the January 6th Committee and say, yep, if Mr. Clark chooses not to appear or respond in a manner that appears to be in compliance with the law, then yes, they should move forward. And both Mr. Clark and anyone else who is tempted to defy congressional subpoenas should be on notice of that. And I think this proceeding has been very useful to that, and that the committee needs to be able to move forward with its work, and that we're ready to back them up. So with that, I'd yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach.
Madam Chair, I just want to associate myself with the comments that have been made by Ranking Member Dr. Burgess, and particularly Congressman Reschenthaler, because he covered everything that I had wanted to. And so with that, I am going to yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you. I really don't have a whole lot to add other than just in terms of how I think about this. It seems to me the question of whether or not Mr. Clark wants to assert his Fifth Amendment right is completely separate and apart from the question of whether or not he answers the subpoena to appear in front of the committee. He can assert that, and it appears that that is his intention to do it, which we would defend. What I do find troubling is the notion that there has clearly been little motivation for Mr. Clark to appear again. He left the deposition, hasn't really made any effort to come back and appear in front of the committee. And it seems to me even at the committee he could assert the executive privilege, although as testimony has been brought out here by the chair and the vice chair, he has not, well, first of all, that the two superior people within the agency have not done so, but to your point, he's free to, I guess, to assert something that they're not. And the Department of Justice has indicated that they don't believe that asserting executive privilege is appropriate in this place. But I'm also moved by the fact that he has not sought to do that in a judicial forum at all. So he's essentially saying, I'm going to rely on a case of which I am not a party. I guess, I could see in the future people saying, well, I'm just going to refuse to answer subpoenas because somewhere in the federal judiciary there may be a case at some point which I'm not a party to, which may have an impact on this, and so I'm just going to not do it and just say I don't have to comply with subpoenas or appear because there are cases elsewhere that I am not a party to that I believe could have relevance for this. That's essentially, and I'm not an attorney, but that's sort of boiled down what the argument is.
No, I think that's, I mean, you're taking the broadest overgeneralization and applying it to a fact where specifically President Trump has asserted executive privilege. Again, if and when that occurs, each one of these cases is individual, but if you're going to say there's a case in Bismarck, North Dakota, and then you get held in contempt, have fun in that courtroom, because that's not how that's going to play out. But he is legitimately asserting the privilege that President Trump asked him, or that President Trump has asserted this executive privilege.
Yeah, and no one else has done that in the department to date. But to your point, I guess he's free to do it. And by the way, this is a hearing about it. We're not taking any action today. I guess we'll make a decision potentially next week, maybe not. Maybe if he complies Saturday and the committee is convinced that his complying and appearing in front of the committee satisfies the need or satisfies their interest, that they won't ask us to proceed. So we're not proceeding today. I think this has been an important hearing. I really do appreciate your comments because you're very thoughtful about this. Appreciate your service. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Desaunier. Ms. Ross.
I have no questions. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was in my office with competing Zooms, but the presentation from my good friend from North Dakota compelled me to come down to the Rules Committee so that we could exchange in a colloquy of sorts and not to get him in any kind of trouble back home, but I say it with all the respect that I can muster. That I actually consider Mr. Armstrong a close and dear friend in the Congress. And
if that gets me in trouble, I'll take it.
And I think he's a fine lawyer, and I think he's made a couple of points today that do merit some further reflection and discussion. I guess the question, the principal question I have, Mr. Raskin stepped out, so I suppose if he comes back, I was going to pose a question to him. There seems to be some confusion about the former President Trump's invocation of executive privilege as it relates to Mr. Clark. And I guess I just want to be very clear. It's your contention that Mr. Clark is essentially arguing that the privilege that President Trump has attempted to invoke applies to him, but that President Trump has not explicitly or expressly invoked that executive privilege as it applies to Mr. Clark. Is that right?
I believe he has in the August 2nd, 2021 letter.
And in that letter, he invokes Mr. Clark specifically?
Please be advised that the party, this is, Dear Mr. Jeffrey Clark, please be advised that the department's purported waiver and authorization are unlawful and that President Trump continues to assert the non-public information the committees seek and should be protected from disclosure by executive privilege. It's the first sentence in the second line.
But what you're referencing is in relation to the Department of Justice's prior letter in which it indicated to Mr. Clark and other officials of the Department of Justice that, in fact, the executive privilege had been waived. So essentially, you're saying that former President Trump has attempted to say to these former individuals at DOJ that notwithstanding what the Department of Justice has informed them, that he is still attempting to assert this privilege. Is that, okay?
Yes.
Just want to make sure, because there seemed to be some confusion, and maybe Mr. Raskin, he missed the colloquy there, but maybe you can just clarify this point. You missed the benefit of hearing from Mr. Armstrong, but without belaboring the point, is it your position that former President Trump has not invoked the executive privilege as it relates to Mr. Clark directly?
He has explicitly not invoked it in a letter to our committee that he said he was not invoking the executive privilege with respect to Mr. Clark. So what I take Mr. Clark's argument to be is that he has the ability to invoke the executive privilege related to Donald Trump, even if Donald Trump is not, if both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are not invoking it.
So that's an important point, and that's what I'm trying to clarify, because what you just quoted is the antithesis of what
I actually
Mr.
think we're talking about the same letter, and I think the best way to take Mr. Clark's position on that is read his lawyer's November 4th, or November 5th letter. You may disagree with it, but he says he believes the privilege is invoked. Mr. Raskin says that whatever is said in the last paragraph with the qualifiers usurps what was said in the second paragraph.
What is said in that last paragraph?
Nonetheless, to avoid further distraction in any way otherwise waiving the executive privilege associated with the matters the committee are purported to investigate, President Trump will not agree to judicial intervention to prevent judicial testimony or the testimony of 5 former department officials, including Jeffrey Clark, who have already received letters, so long as the committee do not seek information for any other Trump administration officials or advisors. So
that seems pretty clear to me. I mean, that seems like that's helpful. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I get what you're saying, that the first sentence of the letter essentially states President Trump's sort of broad position, but then his lawyers are stating his broad position. But ultimately, it culminates in a pretty clear declination of any type of judicial intervention to prevent Mr. Clark from testifying on any matters.
with a caveat that I don't think that they would argue has been negotiated or agreed to.
Well, fair enough.
But I mean, you can't take I mean, it's a whole sentence. It's not just one sentence. It's provided and any other officials have been.
Which paragraph are you referencing? The second to last paragraph?
No, this is the last paragraph in the August 2nd letter. And listen, debating whether that is meritorious or not is not my position to do here. His lawyer lies out very clearly where they are in that, and I think also in that, and I think it's important, and I keep bringing it up. They've also stated in writing that they will abide by the litigation. I can enter this into the record if we want it.
I think you should. Or I think
Please do.
Yeah, we'll endeavor to make sure that's entered the record. In any event, we'll have to agree to disagree. I think based off what you've at least described in terms of the text of that letter, it seems pretty clear to me that Mr. Raskin's articulation of the procedural posture in terms of former President Trump's invocation of executive privilege seems to be correct. Nonetheless, I will just say 2 broader points. Mr. Reschenthaler has stepped out. I wanted to say that I actually concur with respect to the statements he made regarding interpretations of an individual's invocation of the Fifth Amendment and straying clear from that. I would just encourage all of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to adopt that same approach and would point you back to Lois Lerner's testimony before the United States Congress in front of the Oversight Committee back in 2014. And I can provide a litany of different statements made by Republican members of Congress at that time characterizing her invocation of the Fifth Amendment when she testified in front of Mr. Issa's committee in a way that I don't think was respectful of the privilege, just as you agreed with Mr. Reschenthaler. So, and obviously, that's long before me, you, or Mr. Reschenthaler were here in the United States Congress. Second point, because we talk a lot about precedent, in the Rules Committee and norms and the fact that the decisions we make today will set historical precedents for years into the future. It's your position that a witness can invoke executive privilege, or rather essentially say that they will decline to testify at any substantive matters on the basis that those might implicate executive privilege if a former president, or a current president for that matter, has broadly invoked executive privilege in a court of law. That's your position?
I think he's waiting for the legal case to be determined, and I think everybody has the right to do that. And I think the question between a former president and a current president is a different one. And I mean, in all honesty, I think that is significantly distinct, and how that works. I don't believe in the unitary authority of the president. My colleagues do, but I do believe the distinction is different.
And to that point, you would actually make the argument that a current president invoking executive privilege, that your argument would be that in particular witness would have an even stronger case to make, that they don't need to testify until the litigation is concluded. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the Nixon case says the totality. I mean, it can carry past the current presidency, but there's a totality.
Well, I will just say this. I am hopeful that we retain our friends on this side of the aisle retain the majority in the 118th Congress, but I can think of a long list of members of your side of the aisle who have called for the testimony of a wide litany of individuals who work at the White House or others under the Biden administration, or other individuals who are in various other agencies of the federal government. And it seems to me that the hypothetical that Mr. Morelli posed of administration officials simply deciding that they will snub their noses at the United States Congress, irrespective of what political party might be in power, is no longer a hypothetical. It is indeed a reality. And I suspect that many of my colleagues, not Mr. Armstrong, because I take him at his word that he will make this argument irrespective of who happens to have the gavel at a particular moment in time. But I do not believe that is the case for many of your colleagues who will be clamoring to hear from a wide variety of witnesses, each of whom will cite Mr. Clark and Mr. McGahn before him as a precedent to say that they don't need to come into the United States Congress until every single legal remedy is exhausted, not by them, but by any other individual who might have a claim that somehow remotely connects to the claim that they are now asserting before the committee that has subpoenaed them. And I think that's a dangerous precedent for the United States Congress. So with that, I'll yield back. I'll give the gentleman an opportunity to respond.
I would just say, one, this didn't all begin in the last 9 months. I mean, you talked about Lois Lerner. We had the Bill Barr hearing, which I found to be problematic, I think is the best word I could use. We've dealt with this under those things. And I think one of the things that's important as it relates to this is that is potentially where this exists. I don't think there's a loose correlation here. I think, and more importantly, I don't believe Jeffrey Clark nor his lawyer believe there's a loose correlation here. And that is one of the things that the Nixon case actually said, is the combative changeover of presidency from one party to the other, and that's why the totality of the circumstances approach applies. And I think the totality of the circumstance approach would apply in each one of your hypotheticals as well. So that's like legitimately the best I can do on that.
Are there any other questions? Seeing, I want to thank you, Mr. Armstrong. I just want to say, just in conclusion, that we need to make sure we don't forget what this is really all about, and that is a horrific attack on not only the Capitol, but on our democracy. And we need to get this right. And the work of the Select Committee, I think, is vital. And, I think many of us are frustrated by the lack of unanimity in this chamber amongst people wanting to get to the bottom of this. But we have to do, obviously, I think there's a different opinion in terms of the law, but I think the work of the Select Committee is incredibly important. And again, I want to commend the chair and the vice chair. And Mr. Armstrong, I want to thank you for being here. And there are no other questions. You can go. So thank you. Are there any other members wishing to testify on the resolution? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on this resolution. All right, I'd like to now welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 6119, making further continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2022. Chairwoman DeLauro and Ranking Member Granger, we are delighted to see you here. And I now recognize the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Chairwoman DeLauro. Yeah.
Is this on?
Okay.
Want to get the technology right?
You do.
So, thank you. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, I want to just say thank you to you for the opportunity to appear before the Rules Committee to discuss the Further Extending Government Funding Act, which continues government funding at current levels through February 18th and includes the additional Afghanistan Supplemental Appropriations Act. Honestly, instead of sitting at this table discussing another continuing resolution, I wish that we were here to present a bipartisan, bicameral appropriations agreement. CRs are not the way to govern, and it's a short-term patch, which leaves the American people behind. I also might add that I have heard from some of my Republican colleagues on both sides of the Capitol that they would to prefer a year-long continuing resolution. And unfortunately, however, Republicans have refused to negotiate on an omnibus, so we therefore have no choice but to pursue a short-term extension. House and Senate Democrats have put forward their proposals. Republicans have not presented an offer of their own. There is not one piece of paper describing what the other side of the aisle is interested in or not interested in. It has been 30 days since I brought together a bipartisan, bicameral meeting. This was on November 2nd, a Four Corners meeting. And to date, we have heard not one word. We are looking at tabula rasa, a blank page. The legislation before us makes minimal changes negotiated by both sides of the aisle to address the most urgent needs during the period of the continuing resolution. It is my strong belief that by limiting the number of funding and policy changes, we are putting ourselves in a better position to reach a negotiated full-year agreement on government funding. In addition, a separate piece of legislation strongly supported by Democrats and negotiated, I might add, by both parties to provide $7 billion to continue supporting Afghanistan evacuees after the end of 20 years of war is included in this bill. While I wish the February 18th end date were earlier, and I pursued moving more quickly on getting an earlier end date, and again, I might add, that was not of interest with Republican colleagues on the other side of the Capitol. This agreement allows the appropriations process to move forward toward a final funding agreement which addresses the needs of the American people. Because let me be clear, working families, small businesses, veterans, and our military need the certainty that comes with passing government funding bills as opposed to short-term patches like the one before us. For our communities, we need an agreement that would create jobs by supporting small businesses, bolster our public health infrastructure to prevent future pandemics and medical research to save lives, strengthen our public schools with a focus on those serving students with the highest need, protecting our air and water through environmental protection and enforcement efforts, combat the opioid epidemic on the ground and in our communities, support core services such as food safety and consumer product inspections. Without an agreement, investments in all these areas will be denied. For our veterans, we need an agreement to provide sufficient funding for veterans' benefits, reduce backlogs for veterans and their families who are seeking assistance, meet the needs of the VA's healthcare system. Without an agreement, there will be a shortfall that will cause veterans not to receive their benefits in full. For our national security, we need an agreement to support defense readiness and modernization, sustain good-paying American jobs, secure our cyber infrastructure, and strengthen American leadership abroad. Without an agreement, a pay raise for troops will not be funded, while funds will be misdirected to a war that we are no longer fighting. Mr. Chairman, we are ready to go, but we need willing partners to put the American people first. With a new deadline of February 18, now is the time for our Republican colleagues to offer constructive proposals to address the critical issues facing our country by funding the federal government's important work for the American people. I respectfully request an appropriate rule for floor consideration of this legislation, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Granger, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for allowing me to testify. Thank you.
Is that working?
Is it working?
Yeah.
I admit I'm disappointed to be here to discuss a CR rather than a full-year appropriations bill, and so are many people back home. I think it's important to understand why we're in this position. This year, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle crafted appropriations bills with very little input from Republicans. I don't need to go into every detail of our complaints about the process. I can summarize with 3 key points. First, the top-line spending levels do not reflect a bipartisan consensus between members of the House and members of the Senate. Second, the subcommittee allocations represent the priorities of the majority party, with non-defense spending increasing at a much higher rate than defense spending. And third, the policies in the bills are the most extreme that I have seen since I became a member of the Appropriations Committee. The reasons just laid out are why we're so much further behind this year than we were the last 2 years. If we had spoken on this day in 2019 or 2020, I would have told you there were a few unresolved controversial items, but an agreement was in reach on final full-year spending bills. This year has been very different, and unfortunately, we have made no real progress since the summer. At that time, I made it clear that Republicans would not support partisan bills that include irresponsible spending increases and extreme policies. I acknowledge that my distinguished chair has the benefit of her party controlling the White House and having the majority in the House and the Senate. But I think she also recognizes that very few votes separate Republicans and Democrats in both chambers, so there will have to be some give and take. I've suggested that we should use the same ground rules that allowed us to negotiate bills quickly in the last 2 years. These terms were rather simple. The party leaders in the White House reached early agreement on the spending framework. Everyone agreed to drop controversial language and restore long-standing provisions unless all sides agreed to changes. I'm convinced that we cannot have meaningful discussions on full-year appropriations without a similar understanding going in. I wish we would have focused on funding the essential elements of government long before now. I must fund our highest priorities while tightening our belt where we can. This is a process that requires difficult negotiations between parties, and it takes time. Instead, too much time has been spent this year focusing on extremely partisan, costly bills being sent to the president's desk, and there could be another one on the way. I don't think it's realistic for Republicans to negotiate on appropriations bills while another massive reconciliation package is still under discussion. However, I hope that we can make progress once we move into the new year. Before I close, I want to thank Chair DeLauro for continuing to try to find common ground where we are. We have different views on how to finish this year's appropriation process, but I respect her very much for the energy she's devoting to this cause. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate it. I just want to be clear on this CR that we're dealing with here today. it was suggested earlier that Republicans were not consulted or not part of the negotiation to get to this CR. Can you explain? I mean,
Absolutely, not the case at all. I don't know where that arises from. The number of conversations that have included the four corners over the last, I don't know the number of days until late at night, hours. I know during the Thanksgiving holiday, people were on the phone exchanging proposals. We offered, there was counter, offers, back and forth. Every conversation had four-corner representation. And that's just a fact. And I can even tell you what some of my colleagues may have said on the other side of the aisle about some of the issues, and I'm sure that they could say the same thing about how we countered on that. So I don't know where this notion has arisen that there hasn't been any bipartisan conversation. It really is erroneous, and it is frankly not true.
and would you agree, Ms. Granger? I mean, I understand on the bigger bill that there were disagreements, but in terms of this CR, I mean, I have to assume that there was negotiation between Democrats and Republicans. Otherwise, this bill would look a little bit different right at this point.
And it would look very different. And we did not have many discussions that really discussed things. One of the things that we said in putting this bill together is, and the way it's been done in the past, is a framework.
Are we talking about the CR?
Is a framework, and that discussion, how we're going forward first, instead of just jumping into it. Very different.
I can only tell you that the CR, the continuing resolution, had over and over again included four corners, back and forth, over, and particularly, as I said, through the holiday, and I have to say to the staff, and I thank them on both sides of the aisle, because they spent hours away from their families to be on the phone calls to try to hammer out where we were going. It is, aside from where anyone is on the omnibus, that is a different issue, and the two need to be bifurcated, because absolutely, and we're trying to get to, I welcome on the omnibus bipartisan conversations, which we're not there yet, but there have been over and over again four-corner staff participating in the deliberations around the CR, its framework, where we're going, what pieces are included and are not included.
And I know, for example, that you wanted an earlier date than the date that was agreed upon.
And the date that was agreed upon is a date that the Republicans were interested in. I wanted to move in January because I believe, as others on this committee believe, that the CRs are not the way for us to govern. I wanted to move, first I wanted to move in December, then I wanted to move in January, and I have quotes from folks in the other chamber, et cetera, saying, not happening. Let's go to February. Let's go to March. Let's go to a full year. And I then, in the conversations, I said, look, February 18th, not where I want to be, but we need to move forward. We cannot shut the government down. It is our responsibility to keep government open for the American people.
I mean, yeah, the only thing worse than a CR is obviously shutting the government down, which would be a terrible tragedy. We've lived through that before.
Can I just quote Senator Shelby for
Sure,
a moment? Just a statement. He's vice chair of Senate Appropriations. Quote, I am pleased that we have finally reached agreement on a continuing resolution. That says that there was bipartisan discussion and debate around this. Otherwise, I don't believe he would have made that statement.
Ms. Granger, are you going to vote for this continuing resolution?
I haven't made a statement yet, but I don't think I'll be able to vote for it without more input from our side.
That's a vote to shut government down.
I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement of administration policy. in support of this. I also am anxious to get an agreement on an omnibus long-term spending bill. As you know, many of us on this committee have been pushing very hard for a White House conference on food, health, nutrition, and hunger. And there is a small amount of money in this in the bigger bill that would help with that conference. And so I want to make sure that that the White House hears loud and clear that that money is forthcoming, and they ought to say yes to our idea of a conference, because it is incredibly important that we get about the business of coming up with a more holistic and more effective approach to dealing with a real scourge in this country. I mean, there are tens of millions of people in every state in this country that are hungry. Not a single congressional district in America is hunger-free. And this is not a phenomenon that just came as a result of the pandemic. You know, before the pandemic, close to 40 million people didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. And we need to get away from the business of simply managing the problem to actually solving it. And there are some great ideas that are being employed in every state in this country that need to be highlighted and replicated. And some of it may cost money, some of it may not cost anything. In fact, if we do this right, we'll end up saving money. But you know, we have in the Rules Committee here have been doing a series of hearings and site visits on the issue, and we've been in talks with the various cabinet officials and the White House. We just want them to say yes, and it would be a nice gesture as we approach the holidays for them to say yes. So, so I just want to make sure, Chair DeLauro, that you know you're not going to drop this in any negotiation as we move forward on the discussions on the bigger bill.
As you know, my views on the hunger issue are likened to yours in many respects, which is one of the reasons why I'm, you know, supportive of the efforts that you want to make. In addition to which, it's one of the reasons why I pushed for 18 years for a child tax credit. And what we have found is over the last 5 months, when there has been the child tax credit in effect, that we have seen a serious reduction in hunger in the United States. So, and I applaud your leadership on this issue, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate it. And so, President Biden, if you're watching, say yes, and then we'll get off your back.
Just say yes.
Right. Mr. Cole.
Mr. Chairman, that's too good to pass up. I wish you well in your effort. I really do. And I don't think your negotiations with us. I think it's with your administration. And but if I wish you success in that. I mean that quite seriously. And I appreciate the hearings that we've had in this committee. And I have no doubt there would be strong participation on the Republican side. So, you know, I think you probably have bicameral and bipartisan support. The White House just needs to, you know, make the call. And I think everybody would show up and work in good faith.
And see, look at we're in a total agreement here, right?
See, a lot of bipartisanship.
I've learned a lot in the hearings we've had here. I've appreciated them.
If the president's watching, you could turn the TV off now, and we can go on to the other stuff.
Yeah, because it won't be that quite as bipartisan. Look, number one, I'm always pleased to see the chairwoman, the ranking member. These two of my favorite people in Congress. I've worked with them for years. Had the privilege of being on the committee, and Chair and I working on maybe one of the most difficult bills, the Labor H bill. It didn't matter who was chairman. It didn't matter who was ranking member. It didn't matter who was president. It didn't matter which party controlled the Congress. We got the bill done 6 times in a row. And each time I was privileged to be chair, she voted for final passage of the bill. The 2 times she's been chair, I voted for final passage of the bill. So I think we know how to get things done together. And I can say the same thing about my friend, Ms. Granger, who not only led the committee from our standpoint exceptionally well, but I had the privilege of being her vice chairman when she was chair and ranking member, back and forth with our good friend, former chairwoman Lowy, on State and Foreign Ops, and I watched them work together and just do the magic. So, you know, we got the people that know how to do this and have a demonstrated track record of coming together. I'd be remiss not to tell you both. I'm very disappointed, not in you, but the fact that we've gone this amount of time and not made any more progress. It's not the CR that concerns me, it's the underlying bill. And the longer these things go on, I know you both agree with this and know this, the more likely this is to morph into a year-long CR. And I actually tend to think our problems are institutional, not partisan to some degree. I think some of this has to do, this is a big deal, and it has to involve our friends on the other side of the rotunda. And it has to involve the administration. It's not like they're not part of this discussion going back and forth. I just think they've been distracted. The administration's been distracted with the pursuit of the Build Back Better bill, and the infrastructure. Our friends in the Senate have been distracted, and I think are pretty distracted right now for the same reason. But it's frustrating because at the end of the day, the Build Back Better bill is a partisan exercise. It will be a partisan bill. It was partisan here. I guess the opposition was bipartisan because one Democrat did vote against it. But, you know, it's essentially a partisan exercise. Appropriations is a lot bigger. It's a lot bigger. You know, it's more money in a single year than any of these things we're talking about over multiple years, a point that's made by both proponents and opponents alike. But governing the country is the first job that we have. And that means funding, you know, and doing things. I mean, the only person I'm probably happy about this is I guess, President Trump, former President Trump, gets to have his budget for, you know, several more months. It's amazing. So I don't have a lot of questions for you. I'm just expressing frustration that we have not done a better job as a Congress, not as a House, certainly not as a committee. To the chairwoman, the ranker's, you know, credit, we didn't agree on very much, and usually don't on the first appropriations bills, but we got them all done, and they got across the floor of the House, 9 of them, you know, we got a lot of work done early in the year. It just doesn't seem to me, as an appropriator, I'm frustrated we don't seem to have much else that's happened. And so I will take that into account as to when I vote as to what I want to do. But just extending the deadlines doesn't seem to be getting much done. And again, I know that does not reflect any discredit to the chairwoman. I actually agreed with the chairwoman. I like the December deadline, you know, and voiced that, you know, let's sit down and get at it. And I would have been happier with a sooner deadline in January. You know, I'm a little concerned at the February deadline because around here deadlines are alarm clocks, and the longer you put them back, you know, then the less likely you are to get to a result. And we're going to hear the argument in our conference, at least. You know, well, why now? I mean, it's already February. Why not just wait things out? I think that's bad governance, by the way. I do not favor that. I know my friend, the ranking member, does not favor that. And I think the outlines of a deal here aren't that hard to figure out. I mean, basically, the defense number is going to have to go up. Even the Democratic-controlled House Armed Services Committee, the Democratic-controlled Senate Armed Services Committee have both come to a higher number than the president's budget. So that number's going up. And the domestic number, as my good friend, the ranking member, suggests, is way out of whack as to what it's been. That number's going to have to come down. Otherwise, it won't be bipartisan. Otherwise, you've got a year-long CR. And the third thing I would add, and there are a variety of policy positions woven into these bills that we don't agree with. But in particular, if you think you're ever going to get an agreement and not restore all the Hyde protections, that is not happening. We all know that. Everybody on the Appropriations Committee on both sides of the rotunda understands that. So there's your deal. More money on defense, less money domestically, nothing in the bill that the two sides can't agree on other than the things that have always been there, because we did agree on those. In terms of Hyde, you guys have moved your position, that's fine, but it takes both sides to move the position on something like that. So I just lay that out as my frustrated advice to my good friends who know this better than I do, because they've both been appropriators and masters at this longer than I've been on the committee. So I share your frustration. I wish you well. I know my friend, the chair of the full committee and the chair of my subcommittee will be relentless in the pursuit of a deal, because we've been there before. I know my friend, the ranking member, will also do the same thing, because we've been there before and I've watched them do it. You know, I'm a little less certain about our friends on both sides of the aisle on the other side of the rotunda. And at least from my standpoint, the administration has been curiously disengaged from the real job of day-to-day governing. I mean, I think they've marshaled everything behind their big initiatives in the opening year. That's pretty typical for a new administration. But they haven't done the hard work, I think, of outreach in terms of discussions. You know, I didn't find out this morning until you know who and it was almost by accident, like who my legislative liaison with the administration was. Not that that should concern either of you, but there's a whole range of things from VAWA to Native American issues that I've worked with our current president when he was vice president on before, and didn't even have any idea who to talk to. So this process has got to change. So I just say that I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm just frustrated because I know we got two deal makers. I know we can get to a deal, and I can see the outlines of the deal. And for us to go this long without making more progress, which I know frustrates both the chairwoman and the ranking member, you know, it is something that is disappointing to me. And I will say for the record, and I share the chairwoman's view on this, I'm disappointed to see our friends on the other side of the rotunda talking about longer and longer delays. I don't think that does us any good. And drawing out the process, again, runs the risk, because in my view, in the end, and I'll end pretty quickly, Chairman, in the end, these bills will have to be bipartisan, because with all due respect, I think some of the changes that will be made may well cost my friends some votes on their side of the aisle. It certainly worked that way in the past. I've watched us pass bills, and we knew it was the first draft, and frankly, the way this process works is real simple. If you got a Republican House and it's going to pass a conservative bill and it's going to go to the Senate and it's going to move to the left, because the filibuster will force it to move to the left to get the Democratic support they need over there. To my friends on your side, you can pass everything you want over here. When it gets to the Senate, it's going to move to the right because you're going to have Republican votes to get to the filibuster. It just works that way. And in your caucus, I can tell you this is true in my caucus, so it's not meant to be partisan, you'll have some pretty disappointed people that will decide not to vote for the bill that you negotiate in the end, and you'll negotiate the best deal each one of you can get for your respective sides. And we'll have the same thing, but that means in the end it'll have to be bipartisan. And you know, you're going to need votes on each side. So same thing with our friends over there, but I think they do run the risk of and again, I don't put this on this House, and certainly not on our two members in front, but you keep kicking the can down the road, it's going to go all the way down the road. That's bad for the defense of the country. Those two authorizing committees are right. We need to spend more. Those of you that want to spend more domestically aren't going to be able to. You're going to be stuck exactly where you're at. And again, those of you that wanted to take Hyde out of the agreement, I'll give you an early clue, it's coming back in. It'll either be in there because we have a year-long CR and it's already the existing law, or it'll be in there because you can't get a deal without doing it. So with that, I wish you both well. I know you'll be talking a lot over the holidays. If we can be of any service, let us know. But please, please, please get to a deal. And I know you both feel this way. Do it sooner rather than later. Don't let these other things get in the way. This is the governing of the country. This is really the important. This is the defense of the country right now, not a policy that next year or 2 years will be great. This is, I know my friend knows how many social safety net programs there are in our bill that are important to people. And I know some of those are going to get plussed up if we get to a deal. I do. They may not be plussed up as much as my friend would like. It might be a little bit more than my other friend would like, but there's going to be a deal, and they're important that it gets done. So with that, that's my rant of the morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I had to listen to Constitutional Law 101, this will at least be shorter than that was.
Thank you. Anybody on the Democratic side have any questions? What about on the Republican side? Oh, we got Burgess and then Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm glad we're here. I can't say I've been happy with the process. I have particular concerns about some of the Medicare payment cuts that were not addressed in the CR, and that's the subject of an amendment that I will offer at the conclusion of my questioning. I do feel like I'm in an awkward position. I'm an authorizer parked between two appropriators.
What a lucky man.
So I don't want to sound like a whiny authorizer. However,
They're all whiny.
there is a real problem with doing things the way that we are doing them, and not just the CR. The whole omnibus approach, the fact that we don't do our appropriations bills the way we used to when I first got here, and the practical result of that is no cabinet secretary feels that they owe me a return phone call. And unfortunately, it has been the case for the last 10 months. And early on, I was willing to say, okay, new administration, new people, but you can't run things the way we're supposed to run them on that kind of a schedule. There is no reason that I can't get a call back from the Secretary of State. There is no reason that I can't get a call back from the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Health, Secretary of Homeland Security. Real problems at the border, the Secretary Mayorkas will not return my calls. Real problems in HHS, Secretary Becerra will not return my calls. So that is one of the real dangers. And look, if you think it's just a Republican issue, it's not, because the pendulum will swing, the shoe will be on the other foot, and you will find yourselves in the same position, and it is not the way our founders intended us to run this place. Yes, I have some concerns about the CR as I understand it. I don't know why it took so long to get it to us. We were on hold all of day yesterday saying we're going to come in here and do the CR. And now here we are 24 hours later. But leaving the Medicare payment adjustment out of the CR, this is unprecedented. A year ago, we were in the same place. We had our doctors, large and small medical practices facing a almost 9% reduction in Medicare reimbursement rates, evaluation of management codes. It got fixed at the final bell last December. And granted, that was an omnibus, which is different from a CR process, but nevertheless, it got fixed before everyone went over the falls the 1st of January. And that 1st of January date is important, because if you go past it, then you're no longer, those dollars are no longer in the baseline. And yes, it requires offsets and finding of new pay-go formulas to come back and fill those holes, and is completely not necessary. Again, last year with all of the problems that were going on, pandemic in the full flare of the pandemic last December, with vaccines only on the horizon, and we were able to stop this problem. We were able to fix this problem. And this year, we don't seem to be able to. So, Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment that I will ask to be made in order to extend the Medicare payment adjustment for the duration of the continuing resolution. A better solution would be to continue it through the entirety of the calendar year, but I get it that we're just dealing with a continuing resolution right now. Look, we've all said it over this past year and a half during the time of the pandemic. Our medical practitioners, our medical doctors, our nurses, our hospitals, our technicians are our heroes. They have kept the country going at a time when, quite honestly, it didn't seem possible that it would, but they did. And the reward for that is we're going to cut your pay. I mean, it makes no sense. And this committee, the Rules Committee, I'd like to say my authorizing committee will take on this work and get it done. Unfortunately, Energy and Commerce, which has jurisdiction over a vast part of this, with the Committee on Ways and Means, we've done nothing. We've done nothing about this in the last year. So we're stuck now. We're at the 11th hour in the Rules Committee. And I just want to underscore how important it is that this amendment be made in order, allow members to voice or vote their conscience on the House floor, because otherwise our docs are going to be facing significant cuts at January 1st when the clock rolls over from December 31st to January 1st. And it will take a major effort to come back and undo that in the next calendar year. You don't want this to happen if it is avoidable, and indeed it is avoidable. Look, I ran a medical practice. I know how hard it is. I know that it is practically some months a zero margin proposition. You are so close to the wire every single month with the demands and expenses of a medical practice. Let us not put our medical personnel at further risk by allowing these cuts to go into effect. You already have a lot of providers who are thinking, you know what, this has been a tough year. I'm glad I was able to do my part, but I don't know that I need to keep doing my part in the next year and the next year. We can't let that happen. We've got to secure the future of healthcare for this country, and regardless of how you end up paying for it, you've got no care if you don't have anyone there to deliver it. So it is critical that this amendment be made in order, and when the time comes, I hope that the committee will write a rule that reflects this. If not, you can anticipate that I will be offering it for a vote. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
If I might, first of all, I want to thank you for your comments, and I share your concern about the Medicare sequester. But as you rightly pointed out, this is an authorizing issue. This is an appropriations bill, not an authorizing issue. But I also might add that what we did in this bill, we extended any of the authorizing issues that were in the September CR. We just continued those. This was not in the September CR. But let me go a step further if I can. It is, and my understanding is that also, and I hope I quickly get to a conclusion that will be helpful, is that the offset, as I understand it, is problematic because that's the place where we're looking at COVID therapeutics, looking at COVID vaccines, testing. There's the funding that HHS is using to buy a new antiviral. But the point is that, and I think that the offset has some difficulties, and you will discuss that here. But look, I'm going to say this to you. I'm confident that it's going to get fixed. It is my understanding that there is, there in the works, and I can't speak to, because I'm not an authorizer. Can I, anyway, I won't make a comment about that. I'll just I will reserve my commentary. But there is work being done, I understand, on a comprehensive bipartisan solution by the end of the year for all of the medical, the provider issues. And I will make the inquiries about that. Happy to do that because I think it needs to get fixed. And again, I feel confident that we will see a fix on this issue.
First off, if I may, reclaiming my time, the sequester issue is separate from this. And the sequester issue needs to be fixed as well.
Yes.
And that is unfortunate that it even happened, but that was a result of the American Rescue Plan last February and an offset that was provided for that. Medicare sequester was extended. We came back in and said, King's X, we're not going to enforce that this year, but we are building an SGR type problem with the Medicare sequester, but that's separate. And we do have an opportunity to deal with that at some point down the road. But this is the physician's fee schedule that CMS published and put out, and it is going to result in a significant reduction in reimbursement for our practicing physicians and nurses. Mm-hmm. And it is, I wish I shared your optimism that the authorizing committee was going to take this up. We've had a full year, and I have seen no evidence that the leadership in our committee has the least interest in this. They seem to have a glide path of let's do the least amount possible. And as painful as it is for me to say it, because the Energy and Commerce Committee is one of the most significant committees in the United States Congress. We have jurisdiction over 40, 50, 60% of the non-defense budget, but we don't seem to be exercising that right now. Separate and apart from that, we are at this point now with the CR. These cuts are going to go into effect on January 1st. And when they do, it is going to have a profound effect on our doctors who last year we said were heroes. And they did everything we asked them to do in the worst of the pandemic, and the reward for that is we're cutting your pay.
Well, in addition to that, I would just say, and I am optimistic, I believe that there will be a fix, just as there was the last go-round, and the providers will be happy with that. On the other hand, the fact of the matter is that it wasn't in the CR the last time, and in fact, it did get fixed. So that's why I feel optimism, and you're right about energy and commerce and the jurisdiction that it has in these areas. And again, it is my understanding that that this will be resolved before we cross that threshold, which you're concerned about, and I am concerned about as well. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, we could avoid that cliff by including my amendment.
Once again, it's an appropriations bill and not an authorized.
But I do think we all share Dr. Burgess's concern, and we all need to work to make sure that our providers don't take a hit, and we'll figure that. And I believe we will achieve that without using an offset that, quite frankly, I think also would negatively impact some of our providers. And let me also just say that I just for the record, I think the administration, cabinet officials, secretaries ought to be responsive to everybody, whether Republican or Democrat. And one of the things we have done, as you know, Dr. Burgess, in this committee, is we've brought up cabinet officials to meet with people in the Rules Committee. We had Secretary Becerra, McDonough, Buttigieg, Raimondo, Holland, and Fudge so far. We want to go through them all. Everybody's invited to come if they want to come. And I do think that that's an opportunity, if people aren't being responsive, to be able to say, hey, look, I mean, when we make an inquiry or a phone call, we expect a return call, and and who do I call if I don't hear from anybody? But I do think that it is important that I felt this way in the previous administration. Well, whoever, it doesn't matter. I mean, members of Congress ought to get their phone calls returned and their inquiries answered. So anything we could do to help on some of those, just let me know. Happy to work with you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the witnesses for coming in, considering that it's my chairwoman and ranking member. So thank you for coming in, and I yield back.
What a nice thing to say, John, right?
Thank you, Mr. Reschenthaler. Noted.
Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a very quick question, and I think I know the answer, but I will be asked this question, so I want to confirm. So, Chairwoman, is the extension of the livestock mandatory reporting in this CR?
Yes, it is, and it is one of the things that I mentioned before. Any of the authorizations that appeared in the last CR have been extended forward, so yes, it's there.
Thank you. Just wanted to confirm it.
Okay.
Thank you. Yield back.
No other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
You can go. It's great to see you. You can stay if you want to. So this closes.
A lot less painful than the last hearing.
Yeah, this right. This closes the hearing on HR 6119. Okay. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Mr. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 6119, the Further Extending Government Funding Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides... The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule provides that proceedings may be postponed through December 10th, 2021. The measures that were the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative days of November 30th or December 1, 2021, and on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The rule provides that House Resolution 188 is amended by striking December 3, 2021, each place it appears, and inserting January 21, 2022. Finally, the rule provides that on any legislative day of the second session of the 117th Congress before January 10, 2022, the Speaker may dispense with organizational and legislative business, and the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved if applicable.
You've heard the motion from the gentleman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for resolutions of inquiries. 562 days, Mr. Chairman. It's been that long since members of the House, had been prevented from exercising their legitimate oversight prerogatives through the use of resolutions of inquiry. Committees are capable of doing their work. Clearly, the Democratic majority had time to mark up a $4 trillion reconciliation bill. Committees have had time to mark up the NDAA and had time to consider contempt resolution. We just heard testimony on today. When I bring the issue up, Mr. Chairman, you always make the point. We're working on that with your leadership. I know you are. I just want to bring it up again to inspire you to continue to work hard. And again, we've offered this motion 8 different times. Each time we've been rebuffed. We hope we'll be a little bit luckier on the 9th time. But this is an institutional question, really, and doesn't get restored. I would hate the roles to reverse and us not restored. But that, that's a possibility. I don't say that I would support that. I would not. And I know how deeply you care about the powers of the institution, and I mean that with all sincerity. So I just flagged this for my friends in the majority to think about and restore. Again, 562 days is a long time, and we're not in the conditions that we were at that point, and we are, we may all be frustrated, but we're able to work around here. This is not a COVID problem, in my view, any longer. So with that, urge the passage of the amendments and yield back, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate the gentleman's concern. You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. No.
No.
The noes.
On that,
No has it too, yeah.
would request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse?
Ranking member makes some good points, but no.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agree to further amendments.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Burgess.
I was going to offer the amendment you just heard me discuss. And I understand there's a waiver issue or technical issue, and being respectful of the amount of time that we've already spent here, I'm not going to pursue that and go through an appeal of the ruling of the chair and all of the things that would be necessary. But I do want to underscore how important this is, and I'll take you at your word that this is something that is going to receive attention before we conclude our activities for this calendar year.
And we will work together on that. So, any other amendments?
Just a question,
Mr. Perlmutter.
Since I missed most of that hearing, I was curious if one of the anomalies was adding safe banking to the CR. I yield back.
It was not, but we missed you asking that question. All right, so hearing no further amendments or discussion, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentleman from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
Aye.
And the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, we would ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and accordingly, Mrs. Torres will manage it for the majority.
And I'll manage for the Republicans.
All right, so without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.